The valley slept under the first hard frost. Then the sky turned orange. Flames tore up the barn wall like living claws. Animals screamed inside the smoke. A woman burst from the house in bare feet and a thin shawl bucket already swinging in her blistered hands. She ran straight into the heat. No one had told her winter would begin with fire. Buckets, rope, soot blackening her arms to the elbow. The man with the bad leg dragged livestock free while the structure groaned and threatened to fall. They fought until dawn bled gray across the hills, and the last flames finally died. That was when the real danger spoke. A calm voice cut through the ruin. "She's the only one who's been in that barn at odd hours." The accusation hung in the cold air, heavier than the smoke. She stood in the ashes, empty bucket still clenched in her hands, and understood the fire had only been the opening shot. Briar Hollow, Montana Territory, autumn, 1887. The train came in late. Not by much. 20 minutes, but 20 minutes was long enough for half the town to gather on the platform. Long enough for gossip to travel from the feed store to the church steps and back again, gathering detail the way a snowball gathers snow. A mail-order bride, coming in on the 4 o'clock. And not just any bride. The biggest one anybody in Briar Hollow had ever laid eyes on, outside of a traveling circus poster. Addie Winslow felt the stares before she even reached the door of the railcar. She smoothed her skirt, which didn't need smoothing. She'd already smoothed it 11 times since Cheyenne, but her hands needed something to do. Because if her hands stopped moving, her mind would start. And her mind lately was not a safe place to be left alone with. She stepped down. One boot, then the other. The platform boards creaked under her weight in a way they hadn't creaked for the thin young woman who'd stepped off just ahead of her, headed straight into the arms of a man who lifted her clean off the ground and spun her once, laughing, while the crowd cheered. Nobody was going to lift Addie Winslow off the ground today. She heard the creak of the boards. Of course she heard it. She'd been hearing that particular creak her whole life in church pews, in dance halls, in her own mother's kitchen, where the floor had finally been reinforced special, years back, because nothing else had held. The dress didn't help. White. Meant to be white anyway, though 3 weeks of train dust had turned the hem the color of weak tea. It had been let out at the seams twice already, back in Chicago, by a seamstress who kept her eyes down the whole time, and pinned the fabric like she was handling something that might bite her. There hadn't been enough material for the sleeves in the end. Not enough time either, with the wedding date already fixed and letters already crossing, 3 states promising a bride who'd arrive looking like the photograph. So they'd cut the sleeves short, just above the elbow, which meant Addie Winslow stood on a Montana platform in October wearing a wedding dress that looked like it had given up halfway through being made. Because it had. She found him in the crowd almost immediately. Edmund Ray, standing near the ticket window in a coat too fine for a cattle town, hat tipped just so. The exact picture of a man who'd stepped out of a photograph himself. She'd carried his letters across 3 states, folded soft in the bottom of her case, read so many times the creases had gone thin as cloth. He wrote beautifully. She would give him that much. Even now, even standing here with her whole future about to come apart, in front of a crowd of strangers. He wrote like a man who loved a woman he had never met. He was not looking at her the way his letters had promised. He was looking past her shoulder, at the crowd, at who was watching him watch her, Mr. Ray. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel, standing there with her heart going like a rabbit's. I know who you are. Short, flat, like a door shutting somewhere far off. The sound of it arriving after the door was already closed. The crowd went quiet the way a crowd does right before it gets loud again. Somebody's dog barked once and stopped, like even the dog knew enough to wait and see. There's been a misunderstanding. Ray's voice climbed, pitched now for the whole platform instead of just for her. The photograph I received. It was not. He paused, chose his next words with a care that made Addie's stomach drop straight through the boards beneath her. It was not an accurate representation. Her chest went tight. I sent the photograph myself, sir. There was no misrepresentation in it. Then someone lied to both of us. Laughter. Somewhere behind her. Not everyone. Enough. She stood there, because there was nowhere to go. Because a woman couldn't very well climb back onto a train that had already pulled forward toward the water tower, its whistle fading into the hills like it was laughing too, glad to be rid of the whole complicated business. Ray took a step closer, close enough that she caught the pomade in his hair, sweet and cloying. Close enough to say the next part quiet, private, just for her. Except he didn't say it quiet at all. I ordered a His eyes traveled from her face down to her hands. Her shoulders, the whole broad frame of her, cataloging it the way a man catalogs a shipment that's arrived damaged. Not a plow ox. The crowd laughed harder this time. Somewhere in it, a man's voice she never did learn who's called out. Something about how at least Ray's ranch wouldn't need another draft horse. And the laughter went up again. Uglier now, feeding on itself. Addie Winslow did not cry. She'd promised herself that on the train somewhere around Nebraska, staring out at flat land rolling by for hour after hour with nothing to do but think, whatever happened. Whatever he said when he finally saw her in the flesh, instead of in a photograph taken from a careful angle, chin tucked, shoulders turned 3/4 to hide the breadth of them. She would not cry in front of strangers. She had cried enough for one lifetime already, back home, in a kitchen that used to be hers, in front of people who were supposed to have her back and hadn't. So she didn't cry. She stood very still, chin level, eyes forward. Let the laughter wash over her the way rain washes over a roof that's already given up as trying to stay dry, because what else was there left to give? Which is when she noticed him, a man near the freight cars. Taller than most of the men on the platform, though not so tall it drew the eye first the way her own height always did. Canvas and leather instead of Ray's fine coat, the clothes of a man who worked for what he had and hadn't much reason to dress otherwise. He wasn't laughing, wasn't even smiling the tight, held-back smile some men wear when they're deciding whether it's worth the effort to join in. He was just watching her, steady, the way you'd watch weather building over the ridgeline, trying to read whether it would pass on through or settle in and stay. Their eyes met for exactly as long as it takes to draw one breath. Then he looked away, back to the crate he was hauling off the freight car, like nothing at all had happened, like the whole platform hadn't just watched a man discard a woman in front of half the county. Ray was still talking. Something about the railroad seeing to her fare home. Something about hoping she'd find the situation amenable to a quiet return east. No ill will on either side. The kind of phrase a man practices in a mirror before he ever has to use it out loud. He'd already turned half away from her by the time he finished, already lifting his hat to a cluster of bluff businessmen near the depot office, the whole matter concluded in his mind before the words had even finished leaving his mouth. Addie stood alone on the platform. One traveling case, a wedding dress cut short at the sleeves, and the particular hollow silence that comes after a crowd has gotten what it came for and starts slowly to drift away. Because that's what crowds do. They don't stay for the aftermath. They only came for the show. A few of them looked back at her once, on their way past. Most didn't bother. One woman heavyset herself, though nobody had ever said it to her face, the way they'd just said it loudly. To Addie's caught her eye for half a second, with something that might have been sympathy, or might have simply been relief that it wasn't her standing there instead. Addie picked up her case. Her arm was shaking, just slightly, just enough that she had to grip the handle twice before it held steady, because that's what you do. You pick the case back up. You walk. You don't let your legs know yet that they'd like to fold underneath you. Not here, not in front of anyone, not ever if you can manage it. She didn't look at the man by the freight cars again. Told herself that. Firmly. Didn't look, except that on her way past, some part of her that wasn't listening to the stress overturned her head anyway. Just for a second and he was already gone. Vanished into the freight yard like he'd never been standing there at all. Fine. Good even. She had enough to think about without wondering what a stranger's face had meant, or why. Of everyone on that platform, his had been the only one that hadn't made her want to disappear. Because there had been other faces like that before. Her whole life, if she let herself count them honestly. Her father's face, mostly, in the early years, proud of her, plain and uncomplicated, the way a man is proud of a daughter who can lift a full flour sack onto the counter without asking for help, who wins the county fair pie contest 3 years running against women half her size and twice her polish. He'd died when she was 19. After that, the pride had thinned out across the rest of the family like butter, scraped too far across too much bread, until what was left of it barely covered anything at all. Her mother had held on longest. Right up until the end, right up until those last shaking pages in the recipe book, her mother had looked at Addie the way Ezra Calloway had just looked at her from across a train platform, steady, unbothered, like size was simply a fact about a person and not a verdict rendered against them. Everyone else had learned, sooner or later, to look at her the way the crowd had looked at her today, which, she supposed, was simply the shape the world preferred to take, once you stripped away the handful of people, kind enough or stubborn enough to see it differently. She adjusted her grip on the case, started walking toward the boarding house Mrs. Byram had mentioned in her one telegraphed reply to Addie's inquiry, the only lodging in town that hadn't required a husband's name attached to the booking. Behind her, the platform emptied out entirely. The whistle had long since faded into the hills, and Briar Hollow, Montana, went on about its ordinary Tuesday evening, like nothing remarkable had happened there at all, like a woman's whole future hadn't just come apart in broad daylight, in front of a crowd that had already, by supper time, mostly forgotten her name. The boarding house smelled like lye soap and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Ruth Byram ran it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had buried one husband and outlasted two business partners, and she looked Addie over exactly once top to bottom, the way everyone in this town seemed to look at her now, like she was a piece of furniture too large for the room, before deciding, apparently, that the matter required no further comment. Second room on the left. Supper's at 6. You eat or you don't. Makes no difference to me either way, which was, Addie would come to understand, about the kindest thing anyone in Briar Hollow had said to her all day. She didn't go down for supper. She sat instead on the edge of a narrow bed in a room with one window and a washstand, still wearing the dress, because unbuttoning it meant asking for help she didn't have, and reaching around her own back for hooks sewn by a woman who'd been too afraid to touch her properly, even once during the fitting. She sat there until the light went orange, then gray, then gone entirely, and the room filled up with a darkness that felt, somehow, like the only honest thing that had happened to her all day. Because what was there to do? Because the return fare Ray had so generously mentioned would take her back to a city that had already made its opinion of her plain enough. Back to a family who'd stopped writing after the engagement was announced, who'd said kindly, they thought, more, which was worse somehow than if they'd simply been cruel about it outright, that a woman her size ought to be grateful for whatever came along, and shouldn't expect a great deal more than that. Until she wasn't certain grateful was a feeling she had left in her at all. She thought about the restaurant. She hadn't let herself think about it much these past weeks, hadn't had the room in her chest for it alongside everything else. But it came now, unbidden, the way it always seemed to arrive right when she was too tired to hold the door shut against it. The kitchen in Chicago, 2 years head chef, the only woman ever to hold the position, and she'd earned every inch of it with burned fingers and bone-tired nights, and a palate the owner himself had once called the best in the city. Until the night he'd cornered her in the pantry after closing, until she'd said no, clear, unmistakable, and he'd smiled like the word hadn't reached him at all, like it was simply a formality he could wait out, until she'd pushed past him, and the next morning found herself accused, in front of the entire staff, of conduct unbecoming a phrase so vague and so final that nobody had thought to ask what exactly it meant. Nobody except her, and she'd known exactly what it meant. It meant a man protecting his own name by spending hers instead, and finding it a cheap enough price to pay. She had never told anyone the real reason she'd left Chicago. Ray hadn't asked. Her family hadn't asked either, only assumed, the way people do, that a woman her size and her temperament had simply proven too difficult to keep on somewhere fine. She lay down without undressing, and somewhere past midnight, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like nothing in particular, she made herself a promise that had nothing to do with Edmund Ray, or the restaurant owner in Chicago, or any of the men who'd decided, at one point or another, that her worth was theirs to determine. She would not go home smaller than she'd left it. Whatever that meant, whatever it cost, she didn't know yet. But she lay there and decided it anyway, the way you decide things at midnight in a strange room when you've run clean out of other options, fierce, and a little bit desperate, and entirely, completely alone. The knock came at 7:30 the next evening. Addie had spent the day doing what a woman does when she has nowhere to be, and no money to spend, doing it walking the length of Briar Hollow's one real street and back again, twice, drawing exactly the kind of attention she'd hoped to avoid. Curtains twitching, conversation stopping, then starting again, a beat too late, a beat too loud. She'd priced the return fare at the depot window, steeper than she'd let herself hope. She'd have to wire her uncle for the difference, and her uncle had already made his feelings about her situation known in a letter 3 weeks prior, feelings that did not, as far as she could tell, include any further financial assistance. So when the knock came, she nearly didn't answer it at all. Mrs. Byram's voice arrived through the door first. "Man to see you. Says his business won't wait for morning." Addie opened the door expecting Ray. Come to gloat maybe, or apologize in that particular way men apologized when what they really wanted was for the apologizing to be finished so everyone could go back to pretending nothing had happened. It wasn't Ray, it was the man from the freight cars. Up close he was older than she'd first thought, weathered around the eyes in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors and didn't much mind it. He held his hat in both hands, turning the brim slow between his fingers, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at her. Not the way the crowd had looked at her yesterday, different. Like he was doing arithmetic and hadn't reached the sum yet. "Ma'am," he nodded once. Ezra Calloway, Addie Winslow." I know, of course he knew. Everyone in this town knew her name by now. Probably knew the cut of her dress and the price of her train fare too, and had opinions about both. "May I come in?" he said. Not quite a question. Not a demand either. Somewhere in between the way a man talks when he's used to giving orders on a ranch and has to remember in town to soften them into something else entirely. Mrs. Byram, hovering at the end of the hall with the transparent pretense of dusting a windowsill that hadn't needed dusting since summer, made no move to leave. Addie left the door open, stepped back to let him into the small room. Though there wasn't much room to speak of one chair, the narrow bed, the washstand, and now, the two of them, standing, taking up most of what space remained. He didn't sit. "I run cattle," he said. "Stone Creek, valley east of here. 6 miles, give or take." "Congratulations." The word came out sharper than she meant it. He didn't flinch. "I need a wife." Just like that. No preamble. No letters exchanged over 3 states. No careful photograph. No pretense that this was courtship instead of exactly what it plainly was. "I need a wife," he said again, like the first time hadn't landed the way he wanted it to. "Not for looks. Winter's coming hard this year. I can feel it in my leg before I feel it in the sky. I need somebody who can run a house, keep it fed, keep it standing while I do the work outside. That's the whole of it. Nothing more underneath." Addie stared at him, because she'd heard cruelty dressed up nice just the day before on that platform, and she was in no state of mind to trust a man who came bearing plain talk instead. Plain talk could be its own kind of trap, maybe the worst kind, because it asked you to believe it. "You don't know a thing about me. I know you carried that case yourself off the platform." He said it simply. Not quite a compliment. Just an observation, filed away the same careful way he'd been filing crates off the freight car. "Man that left you standing there didn't lift a finger to help. I watched the whole thing happen." Her face went hot. "Then you also watched him call me a plow ox in front of half the county." "I did. And I didn't agree with him." A pause, his jaw tightening. "Didn't disagree loud enough either. Should have said something right there on the platform. Didn't. That's on me, not you." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was closer to one than anything Ray had managed in his entire performance, and it landed somewhere in Addie's chest she hadn't expected it to reach at all. "Why me?" she said. "There's other women in this territory, women who'd fit the bill without the trouble attached." Trouble. He turned the word over like he was checking it for a hidden edge, the way a manchen checks a fence post for rot before he leans his weight on it. "You think you're trouble? I think a man who watched what happened yesterday knows exactly what kind of talk he's inviting, walking me down his own road today." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow that she noticed. "I've had talk before," he said. "Buried a wife 2 winters back. Had talk then too about a widower who couldn't keep his own house in order, couldn't keep hired men on because he was too hard to work for, too broken up to run the place proper. Talk doesn't feed cattle. Talk doesn't get a house through January." He shifted his weight, favoring one leg, though he covered it well enough that most people would never have noticed. "I need somebody who can work. That's all I'm offering, and all I'm asking in return. 1 week. You come out, you see the place, you see if you can stand it. If you can't, I'll pay your fare back myself whatever direction you'd rather go. No talk about it after. No hard feelings either way." The room went quiet, because there it was. The whole offer laid out plain as a fence line running straight to the horizon. No romance in it anywhere. No pretense that this was anything other than exactly what it was. Two people with a practical problem, standing in a rented room above a boarding house, deciding together whether to solve it. And if I can stand it, Addie said slowly. What then? Then we marry properly. Church, papers, all of it done right and lawful. He met her eyes and didn't look away this time, the way he had on the platform. Won't pretend it's a love match. I buried the last one of those. Don't know that I've got another one left in me to give. But I can promise you a roof that won't leak, and a table that won't go empty so long as you're willing to help me keep it that way through the winter. You're not going to ask about my family, Addie said. My people. Where I come from, what sort of woman I was before Ray's letters found me. Does it matter to the work? It might matter to you. Ezra considered that. Really considered it, the way he seemed to consider most things slow, unhurried, like a man weighing a fence post before he trusted his weight to it. Everybody comes out west carrying something they'd rather not unpack in front of strangers, he said finally. I've got my own. Don't imagine you'd thank me for asking after yours the first evening, any more than I'd thank somebody for asking after mine. That's a convenient way to avoid a question, Mr. Calloway. It's a fair way. A ghost of something, almost like humor, crossed his face. There and gone, you'll find I don't do convenient much. Man doesn't have the patience for it. Running a place this size alone. She turned the word over. You said 1 week. You said church and papers if I stay past it. But you never once said anything about wanting a wife the ordinary way. Companionship. Conversation over supper that isn't about the price of beef. Something in his face closed, just slightly, like a shutter drawn against weather it didn't much want to let in. I had that, he said, once. Don't expect to have it twice in one lifetime. I've made my peace with that particular arithmetic. What I'm offering you is a fair trade, plainly stated. Nothing dressed up as more than it is. And if I wanted more than a fair trade, then Stone Creek's probably not the offer you're looking for. He said it without heat, without cruelty either, just fact, laid down as plain as everything else he'd told her tonight. But I'd guess, Miss Winslow, that a woman standing where you're standing right now isn't in much position to hold out for more than fair. Not this week, anyhow. Might be different. Come spring, once you've got your feet back under you properly. I wouldn't begrudge you that, if it came to it. It should have stung. Somehow it didn't. Because there was something almost generous in the bluntness of it, a man willing to tell her exactly where she stood, instead of dressing up a hard truth in soft language the way Ray had dressed up his own cruelty in a fine coat and a rehearsed apology. Fair, Addie repeated slowly. I can work with fair. It was, Addie thought, the strangest proposal a woman had ever received in the history of proposals, and somehow, also, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in the better part of a year. You haven't asked if I can cook, she said. Half a challenge, half something else she didn't have a proper name for yet. Didn't need to. He nodded toward the small stack of belongings by the the corner of the recipe book just visible where it had slid partway loose from the case. Woman who carries her mother's book across 3 states didn't carry it along for decoration. Addie's breath caught somewhere throat. She hadn't told him that. Hadn't told anyone that, not even Ray, in all those months of letters. How did you corners, Warren soft? He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. No mystery to it at all. Only happens from hands that use a thing every day. Not from hands that just keep it on a shelf for show. He settled his hat back onto his head, the conversation concluding itself, apparently, by some private clock only he could hear. 1 week, Miss Winslow. Wagon leaves at first light. No obligation past that. Either direction you choose. He was at the door before she found her voice again. Mr. Calloway. He turned. Why are you really doing this? For a long moment he didn't answer. And when he finally did, his voice had dropped quieter now, like he was admitting something to himself as he was to her. Because I watched a whole town laugh at a woman yesterday for the size God happened to make her. His jaw worked once, tight, like the memory of it still sat wrong in him. And not one of them stopped to ask whether she could do the work. Twice as many smaller women couldn't manage in a single winter. Seemed like a waste to me. And a man can't afford to waste things, come winter. Especially not things worth having. Then he was gone. Boots on the boarding house stairs, fading into the dark street below, gone before she could decide whether that last sentence had been about the work, after all, or about something else entirely, that neither one of them was ready to name. Addie stood alone in the small room for a long time after the sound of him had disappeared. She looked at the recipe book, at the worn corner he'd noticed before she'd even thought to hide it. Mrs. Byram appeared in the doorway a minute later, arms crossed, no longer even pretending about the dusting. "Well," she said, "that's not an offer you get twice in a lifetime, dear. Not the sweet kind of offer. The kind that lasts, though. Those are worth more in the end than most of the sweet kind ever were." Addie didn't answer. But she didn't sleep much that night either. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring again at that same water-stained ceiling, she found herself doing the arithmetic Ezra Calloway had already finished the moment he first laid eyes on her across a crowded platform. 1 week. What did she have left to lose that hadn't already been taken from her once already? In front of half the county, by a man who'd never once meant to keep her. Mrs. Byram had opinions about Edmund Ray, as it turned out, and she delivered them over a breakfast of overcooked eggs, fixed the next morning like a woman settling an old score she'd been saving up for the right audience. "You want to know the truth of it," she said, not waiting to find out whether Addie actually wanted to know. "That man's been writing to a banker's daughter over in Helena the better part of a year now. Rich as sin, that family. Whole thing was arranged before your train ever left Chicago, if half of what I hear from the telegraph office is true, and it usually is." Addie's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "That's not possible. He wrote to me for months. Proposed properly. There was a contract signed. There was a contract, sure." Mrs. Byram refilled her own coffee without offering any to Addie, an oversight that felt, by this point, entirely in character. One that cost him plenty if he broke it clean himself, and cost him nothing at all if the bride happened to break it for him instead. Which is a funny thing to have happen right about the same week a banker's daughter finally says yes to his letters, isn't it? The eggs went cold in front of Addie, untouched, because it made a horrible kind of sense once she let herself actually look at it, the way he hadn't looked at her, not once, until he had a crowd to perform for, the way he'd said his piece loud enough to carry clear to the depot fence instead of pulling her aside, quiet, the way a man breaks difficult news to somebody he respects even a little. He hadn't needed her forgiveness. He'd needed witnesses, a whole platform of them, ready to swear later that it was the bride who'd proven unsuitable, not the groom who'd found a better offer. "Half this town saw him make a fool of you, Mrs." Byram went on, oblivious or simply indifferent to the way Addie had gone very still across the table. "Which means half this town'll swear, if it ever comes to that, that you're the one who wouldn't have him. Cost him nothing at all. Cost," she waved a hand, encompassing interesting, apparently, the entire shape of Addie's situation. "Well, you know already what it's cost you." Addie sat with that for a long moment, until something in her chest, something that had been curled up tight and small since the platform, since the laughter, since the sound of that whistle fading off toward the water tower, uncurled just slightly, not into anger exactly, or not only anger, into something closer to clarity. Because if none of it had ever truly been about her at all, her size, her hands, her unsuitable sleeves, if it had only ever been about a banker's daughter and a contract clause written by a lawyer somewhere who'd never once laid eyes on her, then maybe the shame she'd been carrying since yesterday afternoon belonged somewhere else entirely. Maybe it belonged to him. She sat with the thought a moment longer, turning it over the way she'd turned over so many other things these past 2 days. Because shame, she was learning, wasn't a fact handed down from on high. It was a story somebody else told about you, loud enough and often enough that you started repeating it to yourself in your own voice, until you couldn't tell anymore where their words ended and your own began. Edmund Ray had told a story about her on that platform. A cheap one. Convenient. It had cost him nothing and nearly cost her everything, and she'd spent 2 full days wearing it like it was true simply because he'd said it loud enough for a crowd to hear. But a story only holds together as long as you keep telling it to yourself. She could stop. Not all at once. She wasn't foolish enough to think shame worked that tidily, that a woman could simply decide one morning over cold eggs to never feel it again. But she could start. Today. In this kitchen, in this town that had already shown her both its cruelty and, in small unexpected doses, its plainer kindness. She stood from the table, left the cold eggs where they sat. "Where does a woman find a ride out to Stone Creek?" she asked. Mrs. Byram looked up, coffee cup halfway to her mouth, something flickering across her face that might have been the beginning of respect. "Wagon out front's already hitched, far as I saw walking past it not 10 minutes ago." Addie carried her own case down the boarding house stairs. Nobody offered to help her with it. She hadn't expected anyone to. 2 days ago that would have stung. This morning it simply confirmed something. She was still in the process of learning about this town that Briar Hollow watched a great deal more than it ever lifted a finger to assist. The street was already awake by the time she stepped out onto it. A dry goods store propping its shutters open. A boy sweeping the boardwalk in front of the barber shop, sweeping the same 3 feet of it over and over so he could keep watching her walk past. 2 women outside the church, heads bent together, voices dropping the moment Addie came within earshot and rising again, a little too bright, and the moment she'd passed. She kept her chin level, kept her pace even, because that was the only answer she had left to give a town that had already decided, before she'd said a single word to any of them, exactly what kind of woman she must be. Near the depot fence, an older woman stopped sweeping her own porch long enough to actually look at Addie directly, not the sideways glance most of the town had settled on, but a full, unhurried look, the kind that took its time and didn't apologize for taking it. "You're the one from the platform," the woman said. Not unkind, just plain the way Ezra himself seemed to favor plain. "I am. Heard you're headed out to Calloway's place." Word had traveled fast, faster than Addie had managed to travel herself. "I am," she said again, because there didn't seem to be much use in pretending otherwise. The woman studied her a moment longer. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded once, firm, like a woman closing a ledger on a sum she'd finally finished working out in her head. "Man's had a hard go of it since he lost Eliza. Ranch don't run itself, and grief don't cook supper." She went back to her sweeping. The conversation apparently concluded on her end. "Hope you're sturdier than you look, is all. Though from where I'm standing, I'd guess you probably are." It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either, and after 2 days of very little in between, Addie found she'd take it gladly. She reached the wagon a few minutes later, stood beside it a moment, one hand resting on the worn wood of the seat, and made herself take a full breath before climbing up. Because whatever waited for her out past those hills, it couldn't possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind on this street. She believed that, mostly. The road to Stone Creek ran east through country. Addie had no proper words for yet, not the kind of words that would come later. Once she knew the land well enough to love it the way you love a thing that's tested you and let you stay anyway. For now, it was simply wide. Wider than anything Chicago had ever shown her, gold grass rolling in long unbroken waves toward mountains that looked close enough to touch and were, she'd learn soon enough, the better part of 2 days' ride away by anyone's reckoning. Ezra didn't talk much on the drive, which suited her fine. She had enough already churning through her own mind, without needing to fill the silence for the sake of filling it. They passed a small homestead about halfway along the road, smoke curling steady from its chimney, a woman out front hanging wash despite the cold. Ezra lifted 2 fingers off the reins in greeting. The woman lifted a hand back, then paused just for a beat, taking in the sight of Addie beside him on the wagon seat, before her face settled into something unreadable, and she went back to her wash without another glance. "Agatha Mercer," Ezra said, by way of explanation that wasn't really an explanation at all. Nearest neighbor. Sharp eyes. Sharper memory. Nothing happens in this valley she doesn't know about within the day. Should be worried. Should be glad. More like. Woman like that notices things other folks miss. Comes in useful time to time. He didn't elaborate further. Addie filed the name away regardless. The way you file away the name of anyone who might one day matter more than they seemed to at first meeting. The land kept unrolling past the wagon wheels. Long grass gone gold and stiff with the first frost, a hawk somewhere overhead, circling something in the grass that Addie couldn't see and didn't especially want to. The mountains hadn't moved any closer in the last hour, though she'd have sworn, watching them, that they ought to have by now. Because that was Montana, she was starting to understand. Distances lied to you, made a thing look close enough to touch, and then made you ride half a day toward it without ever quite arriving. Not unlike the whole shape of her situation, if she wanted to be honest about the comparison. She thought about Chicago, about the sound the city made at all hours, street cars and shouting, and the particular clatter of a kitchen at full service, 6 burners going and every hand in the place moving at once. She'd loved that noise once. Hadn't known, until it was gone, how much of her own sense of herself had been built out of being good, being excellent, even at something loud and difficult in front of people who mattered. This was the opposite of that entirely. Quiet land, a quiet man, a kitchen that hadn't heard a proper meal cooked in it for 2 years running. She wondered, watching the grass roll by, whether she could build herself back up out of quiet instead of noise, whether a woman's worth needed an audience at all, or whether it might hold up just fine with only one man and a cold stove bearing witness to it. She didn't know yet, but she was. She realized somewhere around the second hour of the ride, curious enough to find out. And curiosity, after 2 days of nothing but shame and cold eggs and a town's worth of sideways looks, felt like the first genuinely new thing she'd let herself feel since stepping off that train. "You're quiet," Ezra said finally, maybe an hour into the ride. Not quite a question either. "I'm thinking." About the offer? About Edmund Ray. She hadn't meant to say his name out loud again. It came out anyway, flat and cold as the morning air pressing against her cheeks. "Turns out I wasn't rejected for my size at all. Turns out I was rejected for a banker's daughter, with a better bank account than mine will ever be." Ezra's hands went still on the reins for just a moment. "That true?" "So I'm told. By a woman who seems to know everything that happens within 20 miles of her own porch." He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time, thinking quiet, instead of nothing to say quiet. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge to it she hadn't heard the night before. "Man like that doesn't deserve the trouble of hating him proper. Not worth the effort, in my experience." He clicked his tongue at the horses, urging them up a low rise where the wind picked up sharp and cold. "Best thing you can do with a man like that is let his name work its way clean out of your mouth. Takes practice. Worth doing anyway." It wasn't comfort, exactly. Ezra Calloway didn't seem built for the soft kind of comfort, the kind that came wrapped in gentle words and careful hands. But it was something. A hand extended, rough-palmed and plain, in roughly the direction of comfort's general neighborhood. Addie found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it helped more than the soft kind might have managed. "And your leg," she said, after a while. "You favor it. Been meaning to ask." "Old accident. Wagon wheel, bad ground, worse luck." He said it too quick, too smooth, the way a man says a thing he's said so many times it stopped feeling like a lie even to himself. "Heels slow this time of year." Nothing more to it than that. Addie let it sit, didn't push. She had her own carefully worn stories. After all stories told so many times, the true edges had gone soft and unfamiliar even to her, and she recognized the shape of one when she heard it from somebody else's mouth. But she noticed it, filed it away, the same as she'd filed away Agatha Mercer's name. Because a woman who survives on her wits learns, sooner or later, to notice everything, even the things nobody's ready to explain yet. Stone Creek Ranch sat low in a valley, the color of late autumn wheat. A house and barn and outbuildings clustered against a creek that ran fast and cold even this late in the year. The house itself was solid, well built, and Addie could see even from the wagon seat. A house that had gone a little quiet with neglect, the kind of neglect that comes not from carelessness, but from a man doing everything alone for far longer than any one man ought to have to. Ezra brought the wagon to a stop in the yard. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward the house without further ceremony, already climbing down. "Rest of it you'll see soon enough. I've got stock to check before this cold sets in proper." And then he was gone, off toward the barn with a gait that favored his right leg more than she'd noticed the night before, leaving Addie standing alone in the yard of a stranger's ranch with nothing but her traveling case and a recipe book worn soft at the corner. She let herself into the house. The kitchen told her everything the man himself hadn't bothered to say out loud. A stove gone cold and neglected, though not for lack of care. She could see, even in a single glance, that somebody had once kept this room with real devotion. Shelves built a little too high for a woman of average height. Built, she understood without needing to be told, for a woman who hadn't been average in her own right either. Once. A stack of dishes that didn't match, mended more than once by careful hands that had run out of patience somewhere along the way. Or maybe just run out of time. The bones of a good kitchen wearing the thin, tired look of a house that had lost the person who used to run it and hadn't quite figured out how to go on without her. Addie set her case down. And for the first time, since stepping off that train 2 days before, she felt something other than shame settle into her chest. She felt useful. Which was, she thought, turning slowly in the quiet kitchen with its cold stove and its 2 high shelves, perhaps the closest thing to hope she'd let herself feel in longer than she could rightly remember. She went looking for water first. Found the pump out back, and beyond it, the barn weathered gray, doors standing open to the cold afternoon light. A man stepped out of the shadows inside before she'd gotten close enough to call a greeting. Older than Ezra. Leaner. A face that arranged itself into something like a smile the moment he saw her, though the smile didn't sit quite right, didn't reach all the way up into his eyes the way an honest one does. Well, now. He wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt unhurried. You'd be the new arrangement, then. Addie Winslow, Elias Crane. Run things around here, the outside of things, anyhow. Have done for some years now. He looked her over the way half this valley seemed to have taken up looking her over as a kind of local pastime. Not cruel about it, not the way Ray had been, but careful, measuring. The way a man measures something he hasn't yet decided whether to trust. Calloway didn't waste much time bringing you out here. Man says he needs a wife before winter sets in. Does he now? Something flickered across Crane's face there and gone so fast, Addie couldn't have sworn to it even a minute later. Well, he'd know his own needs better than most, I suppose. There was a strange weight to the way he said it, a little too careful, a little too smooth, the way Ezra's own explanation of his bad leg had been a little too smooth the morning before. Addie filed it away. The same place she'd filed Agatha Mercer's name, and the particular tightness in Ezra's jaw whenever the subject of his leg came up. Pumps just there, if that's what you're after, Crane said, nodding past her shoulder, already turning back toward the barn's dim interior. Kitch'll need a proper stocking before long. Cellar's this way. You're wanting to see it, though I expect Calloway will want to show you himself. Once he's finished with the stock, I can find my own way, Mr. Crane. Thank you. Suit yourself. He paused at the barn door, looking back at her one more time, that not quite right smile, settling back into place. Welcome to Stone Creek, Miss Winslow. Hope it suits you better than it suited some. He disappeared back into the shadows before she could ask what, exactly, he meant by that. Addie stood in the yard a moment longer. Water, forgotten. Turning the exchange over in her mind the way she'd learned, over the last 2 days, to turn over every strange thing anyone said to her, looking for the shape of the trap underneath the words. She didn't find one, not yet. But she remembered it anyway, filed carefully, alongside everything else this valley had already shown her, without quite meaning to that Stone Creek ranch, for all its wide-open honesty, was keeping at least a few things back in the shadows, same as everywhere else she'd ever been. She filled her bucket, walked back toward the house, and put Elias Crane out of her mind for now, because there was flour waiting, and a cold stove that needed lighting, and a man coming in from the fields who'd asked her, without ever quite saying so, to prove herself worth the trouble of keeping. She'd found the stove first, coaxed a fire into it with kindling from a box by the door, hands sure even though her mind kept snagging on small things and Crane's odd smile, Ezra's too smooth answer about his leg, the strange gap between a man who'd offer a stranger a week's trial out of what he'd called simple practicality, and a man who'd noticed, without being told, exactly which corner of her recipe book had gone soft from use. None of it added up cleanly. Not yet. But the fire caught, and the flour, once she'd sifted the weevils out and set the good of it aside, felt like something solid to hold on to, while the rest of the day's strangeness sorted itself out around her. She was 3/4 through kneading a loaf when she heard his boots on the porch. Her hands didn't stop moving, and couldn't afford to, not with the dough at exactly the stage where stopping meant starting over. But some part of her went very still all the same. Waiting the way you wait for weather you can feel coming before you can see it. Because she understood somehow, without being told, that whatever came next in this kitchen would matter more than anything that had happened on that train platform 2 days before. Ezra found her there an hour later, sleeves rolled, apron borrowed from a hook by the door, already elbow-deep in flour she'd found in a bin gone half stale from disuse. He stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed him standing there at all. You didn't have to start tonight, he said. I didn't have anything better to do with my hands. He didn't argue that. She could feel him watching her, the way he'd watched her on the platform, 2 days before, steady, unreadable like whether he was still trying to gauge the shape and speed of. It made her nervous in a way Ray's cruelty never had. Cruelty, at least, she knew how to brace herself against. She'd had years of practice. This was something else entirely. Can you cook? The question landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Simple words, 2 syllables, and 4. But there was weight underneath them that had nothing to do with flour or fire or supper at all. And Addie understood, standing there with her hands white to the wrist, the smell of yeast rising warm around her, that this was not a question about the evening meal. It was the only question that had ever really mattered. asked plain by a man who apparently didn't know how to ask things any other way. She set down the bowl. She turned, met his eyes across the kitchen the way she hadn't quite managed to meet Ray's, not even once, not even at the very end when it might have mattered most. Silence stretched between them, long enough that Ezra's jaw tightened like he was already bracing for whatever answer might come, already half expecting it to disappoint him, the way most things in the last 2 years had found some new way to disappoint him, because Addie's mind, in that stretched-out silence, was doing what it always did under pressure, racing, circling back on itself, catching on Ray's voice first a plow ox, in front of the whole platform, and then, right behind it, on the restaurant owner's voice, the one that had smiled at her no, like it was a formality he could simply wait out. 2 men, 2 rooms, the exact same lesson taught twice over, in case she hadn't learned it well enough the first time, except this wasn't that. This man wasn't smiling at all, wasn't cataloging her the way Ray had, wasn't waiting her out the way the restaurant owner had. He was only standing there, jaw tight, asking a plain question and bracing, actually bracing. She could see it in his shoulders for an answer. He clearly expected to cost him something, which was, when she let herself sit with it for even half a second, the strangest thing of all. So she stopped circling, stopped racing, set the question down in front of herself, the way she'd set down the mixing bowl a moment before, and answered it the only way she knew how to answer anything that actually mattered. I can cook. Addie's voice came out low, even, not a syllable of it shaking. But I won't cook for a man who looks at me like I'm damaged goods. Ezra didn't move. If you're asking because you want to know whether I can keep your family fed through the winter that's coming, the answer is yes. She stepped closer, just one step, flour still on her hands, on her wrists, dusting the hem of a borrowed apron that had, until recently, belonged to somebody else. And I will cook until neither you nor this house remembers what it ever felt like to go hungry. The kitchen went utterly silent, because Ezra Calloway, a man who had buried a wife, run a ranch alone through 2 hard winters, faced down banknotes in bad weather, and worse men without ever once, raising his voice, stood in his own doorway and found, for close to a full minute, that he had absolutely nothing left to say. It was the first time in longer than he could remember that anyone had left him speechless, truly speechless, not the polite silence of a man carefully choosing his words. The other kind, the kind that comes when something lands somewhere far deeper than words usually manage to reach at all. Well, he said finally, rough around the edges. Supper then. Supper, Addie agreed, and if her voice caught just slightly on the word, just the faintest tremor gone as quick as it came, neither one of them mentioned it out loud. She made do with what the kitchen offered. Beef gone tough with age, softened slow over the low fire until it fell apart under a fork. Root vegetables from a cellar that hadn't been properly sorted in longer than anyone would readily admit. A bread starter she coaxed back to life with nothing more than warm water, patience, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had nowhere left to prove herself except one small kitchen in the middle of Montana. By the time the meal was ready, full dark had settled heavy over the valley. Ezra ate the way a man eats who has somewhere along the way that a meal could be more than fuel to keep a body moving. Slow, deliberate. Halfway through, his fork stilled entirely, and he sat for a moment just looking down at the plate, like it belonged to a different, better house than the one he'd been living in alone. Been a long time, he said, since this kitchen smelled like that. He didn't say more than that. Didn't need to. Addie understood, watching him, and woman, that she had stepped into a room shaped by absence, by a woman who used to stand exactly where she was standing now, whose name hadn't been spoken once since her arrival 2 hours before. You met Crane, he said, partway through, not quite a question. I did. And? Addie considered how to answer that. Considered, too, how much of a stranger's ranch she was entitled to have opinions about, after less than a single afternoon spent standing in it. He was polite enough. That's not what I asked. She looked up at him, found him watching her with that same steady weather-reading patience he'd worn on the platform, waiting her out. He said something odd, she admitted finally, about hoping the place suited me better than it suited some. Didn't explain what he meant by it. Something crossed Ezra's face. Quick. Gone before she could name it properly, the same flicker she'd seen in Crane's own expression out by the barn. Though she couldn't have said, watching it happen, whether the 2 flickers meant the same thing or something else entirely. Crane's been here longer than I have, in a manner of speaking, Ezra said at last. Knew this land bought into it. Man's earned the right to a few odd notions, I suppose. It wasn't quite an answer. Addie noticed that, too, filed it away, same as everything else. Is there something I ought to know, Mr. Calloway? Nothing that concerns tonight's supper. He said it steady enough, but his eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment, somewhere past her shoulder, past the kitchen wall, out toward whatever lay beyond it. Then he came back, and whatever had pulled his attention away closed up behind his face like a door. Ask me again once you've decided you're staying past the week. Might be I'll have a better answer for you by then. It was, Addie thought, a strange thing for a man to say to a woman he'd known for exactly one day. But she was learning, fast, that most things about Stone Creek came wrapped in that same particular strangeness, plain on the surface, and considerably less plain the longer you let yourself look at them. When the meal was finished, Ezra pushed back from the table. Thank you, he said. Simple, direct, the same way he seemed to say everything. Then he was gone, out to check the stock one last time, before the cold set in fully for the night, leaving Addie alone at a table built for a family bigger than the one currently living in this particular house. The barn was dark by the time Ezra reached it, lantern light, throwing long shapes across stalls. He could have walked in his sleep by now, had walked in his sleep, more nights than he cared to count these past 2 winters. He checked the horses first, then the 2 milk cows huddled together against the coming cold. Habit, mostly. The animals didn't need him standing over them this late. Crane had already seen to the evening feed, same as always, thorough as always, which was one thing Ezra had never once had cause to complain about in all the years the man had worked this land. He stood a while in the quiet anyway, because the barn was where he did his thinking, had been since Eliza died, since the house itself had gotten too loud with her absence to think straight inside it. He thought about Addie Winslow's voice in his kitchen. I will cook until neither you nor this house remembers what it ever felt like to go hungry. He'd heard plenty of promises in his life. Bank managers, cattle buyers, men shaking his hand over a fair price, and then finding a reason, 6 months later, to remember the price differently. He knew the sound a promise made when a man or a woman didn't fully mean to keep it. That hadn't been the sound he'd heard tonight, which unsettled him more than he was ready to admit, even standing alone in a dark barn, with nobody but the horses to overhear him admitting it. Because a man plans for a winter, plans for feed and firewood, and a roof that holds against the weight of snow. He had not planned walking into town 3 days back for supplies he still hadn't finished collecting, on standing at a train platform, and losing track of every other thought in his head, over the particular way a woman held her chin level while an entire crowd laughed at her. He hadn't planned on any of this, and yet here it was anyway, sitting at his supper table in a borrowed apron, asking him questions about Crane he didn't yet have honest answers for. Ezra blew out a breath, watched it fog white in the cold barn air. 1 week, he reminded himself. That was all he'd offered, all either of them had agreed to. Plenty of time yet for this whole strange arrangement to prove itself either sound or foolish, and no sense standing in a barn at 9 o'clock deciding the matter early, before the facts had even had a fair chance to come in. He hung the lantern back on its hook, headed for the house. But some part of him, the part that had gone quiet along with the rest of the place these past 2 years, had already started, somewhere past his own good sense, to hope. Addie washed the dishes herself, alone, in a kitchen gone quiet with dusk. She found her room after up a narrow staircase. Under the eaves, a bed and a washstand and a small window facing east toward hills, already gone dark against a darker sky. Smaller than the room at Mrs. Byram's. Colder, too, with no fire laid yet and no one to lay it for her. She didn't mind, because it was, in its own small way, the first room in longer than she could remember that hadn't come with someone else's judgment already baked into the walls. She set her case on the bed, opened it slow. The recipe book sat on top, same as always, its worn corner catching the last gray light through the window. She lifted it out, held it the way she'd held it every night, since Chicago, careful, both hands, the way you hold something that can't be replaced if it's dropped. Her mother's handwriting filled the first third of it, neat at the start, looser toward the middle, where the recipes had come faster than the hand could quite keep pace with. Shakir still by the final pages, written in the last winter, when her mother's hands had started their long, slow refusal to hold a pen steady at all. Addie didn't open to those last pages, not tonight. She wasn't ready for those most nights, let alone this one. She opened instead to the middle, A stew recipe, annotated twice over in 2 different years. Corrections layered on, corrections the way a life gets layered on itself, if you're lucky enough to keep living it. Beside one line, in the margin, her mother had written a note that had nothing to do with cooking at all, just 5 words. Added some ordinary afternoon, for no reason Addie had ever learned. You were built for keeping. She'd read that line 100 times over the years, and never once understood fully what her mother had meant by it. Not the way she understood it tonight, sitting in a cold room in a stranger's house, having just told that stranger, in his own kitchen, exactly what she was capable of keeping fed through a Montana winter. Maybe her mother had known something Addie herself hadn't figured out yet at the time. Mothers sometimes did, wrote things down early that a daughter wouldn't need until years later, when the words finally arrived at the right moment to be understood. Addie closed the book, held it against her chest a moment, the way she used to hold it against her chest as a girl, sitting on the kitchen floor while her mother worked above her, humming something without a tune Addie had ever learned the name of. Downstairs, she heard Ezra's boots cross the kitchen floor. A door. Silence. She lay back on the narrow bed without undressing, same as the night before at Mrs. Byram's, and stared up at a ceiling that had no water stain at all, just old wood. Honest and plain, the kind of ceiling that didn't ask a woman to be anything other than exactly what she already was. It was, she thought, drifting slowly toward sleep, despite the cold room and the strange bed, and the whole impossible turn her life had taken in the space of 2 short days. The first ceiling in longer than she could remember that had felt like it might, one day, belong to her, too. Later, long after the dishes were washed and the fire banked low, Ezra stood alone in the small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to him and Eliza both. He hadn't gone in there much, not in 2 years. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't entirely name, reasons that had something to do with flour on a stranger's wrists, and a voice that hadn't shaken once, not even facing him down in his own kitchen. With nothing to her name but a worn recipe book and 1 week's worth of nerve, he found himself opening the bottom drawer of the old chest by the window. There was a letter there. Eliza had written it the winter before she died, when the fever had already started taking pieces of her future away from her, and she'd known it, so known it better than the doctor had ever let on to either of them. Ezra had read it exactly once, the week after the funeral, sitting on the edge of this same bed, with his hands shaking too badly to hold the paper steady, and hadn't been able to look at it again since. He didn't read it again tonight either. He just held it, turned it over once in his rough hands, the paper gone soft at the folds, the same way Addie's recipe book had gone soft at its corner from years of honest use. Because Eliza had written something in that letter he'd never told a living soul, a description, specific enough that reading it again tonight, of all nights, would have felt less like memory and more like being caught out by something he wasn't ready to explain even to himself, let alone to anyone else. He put the letter back in the drawer, closed it, and told himself, the way a man tells himself things he isn't quite ready to believe yet, that it didn't mean anything at all, that it was only paper, only old grief finding some new excuse to surface after 2 years of staying buried where he'd put it, because it couldn't mean what it looked like it meant. Because a dead woman didn't reach across 3 years and pick out her own replacement. Didn't work that way. Couldn't work that way. And a grown man with a ranch to run had no business standing in a cold room past midnight entertaining the notion that it might. Except Eliza had never been a fanciful woman. Practical to her bones. Same as he was. Same as he made himself stop that thought before it finished forming. Except she'd written it down anyway. Clear as anything. Months before the fever ever took hold of her. Long before there was any earthly reason to be thinking about who might come after, which meant either it was coincidence, or it wasn't. He didn't have an answer for which. Didn't much want one tonight, standing alone in a room that still, after 2 years, held the particular quiet of a woman who used to fill it up with noise he'd give almost anything to hear again. So he stood there a long moment more, before he managed to walk away from that drawer entirely. And somewhere upstairs, in a room that had sat empty for 2 winters running, Addie Winslow lay awake, listening to a house settle around her new sounds, unfamiliar creaks, the particular quiet of a place that had, for one evening, at least, remembered what it felt like to be properly fed. She didn't know about the letter. She didn't know, yet, that a dead woman's handwriting had described her down to the set of her shoulders, down to the particular strength in a pair of capable hands 3 years before she'd ever set foot on a train bound for Montana at all. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had fallen asleep without dreading the sound of anyone's laughter. Outside, the first real cold of the season moved down off the mountains and settled over Stone Creek like a held breath. Winter was coming. And whatever this arrangement was, practical, plain spoken, built on flour and honesty instead of love letters and careful photographs it had, in the space of a single day, already become something neither Addie Winslow nor Ezra Calloway quite had the words for yet. They would find the words eventually, but not tonight. Tonight there was only the quiet and the cold settling in over the valley, and 1 week still left to prove to a whole skeptical county, and to each other, and maybe most of all to themselves, that some things worth keeping don't come wrapped in a photograph at all, because a photograph only ever shows one careful angle. Chin tucked, shoulders turned 3/4 to hide whatever the sitter's been taught to be ashamed of. It takes a kitchen to show the rest. A cold stove brought back to life. A loaf of bread rising slow and steady through the night, patient as anything, needing nothing from anyone except time and warmth and a little bit of faith that it would come out right in the end. Somewhere down in the yard, a dog hadn't yet met, barked once at nothing and settled again. Somewhere out past the barn, Elias Crane's lamp still burned, later than a working man's lamp had any honest reason to burn. And somewhere below her, in a cold room off the kitchen, a man who'd buried one wife stood a long while with an old letter in his hands, wondering whether grief was playing tricks on him or whether, for the first time in 2 hard years, something else entirely had finally walked through his door. Neither one of them said any of it out loud that night, but the house held it anyway, the way old houses do, patient, watchful, keeping every secret exactly as carefully as it kept every promise, until the day finally came when both would have to be spoken. That day wasn't today. Today there had only been flour and honesty, and one plain question finally answered the way it deserved to be answered. Tomorrow would bring the rest. Stone Creek Ranch, the trial week. The first morning the frost came early. Addie woke before the house did, before the roosters, even, which she hadn't known was possible until she found herself standing in a cold kitchen at 4:30, breath fogging in front of her, coaxing yesterday's coals back to life with hands that hadn't fully thawed from the walk downstairs. Because that was the arithmetic now. Not romance. Not even really a courtship, whatever Mrs. Byram back in town wanted to call it. Work. Plain and simple. A week's worth of proving. She had the bread rising by the time Ezra came down, had eggs going, had the whole kitchen smelling like something a family might actually want to wake up for. He stopped in the doorway, same as the night before. Looked at the stove. Looked at her. You're up early. So are you. Ranch doesn't run on late mornings. Neither does a kitchen. He almost smiled at that almost. Addie was starting to learn the shape of his almost smiles, the way they lived mostly around his eyes, never quite committing to his mouth, like a man out to practice the whole business of being pleased with something. She'd take it. An almost smile, this early in an arrangement built on flour and honesty instead of anything softer, felt like a small fortune. The second morning brought her first real test, though nobody had warned her it was coming. She heard the commotion before she understood it. Cattle bawling, wrong-pitched, the sound carrying clear across the yard, while she stood at the stove with bread only half-proofed. By the time she reached the door, Ezra was already limping fast toward the north pasture, and 2 of the young steers had gotten themselves tangled through a gap in the fence line. Panicked, one of them down on its side, in a way that looked like trouble. Get the rope, Ezra called back, not stopping. Barn wall left of the door. Addie didn't ask which rope. Didn't ask anything at all. She ran. She found it exactly where he'd said, grabbed it, and by the time she reached the pasture, her hands already knew what to do with it. Not from any ranch upbringing. She'd never so much as touched a steer before that morning, but from a lifetime of hauling, hoisting, holding steady things that most other hands couldn't manage alone. Here, she had the rope looped and thrown before Ezra could tell her how. Other side. He looked at her for exactly 1 startled second. Then he moved, and between the 2 of them, working without a single wasted word, they had the downed steer back on its feet, and the gap in the fence held closed with a spare rail inside of 10 minutes. Ezra stood afterward, breathing hard, leg clearly paining him more than he'd let on. Where'd you learn to throw a rope like that? I didn't. Addie was breathing hard herself, hands raw from the rope, heart still going fast from something that wasn't only exertion. I learned to lift things nobody else in a kitchen could lift. Never much difference, far as I can tell, between a 100-pound flour sack and a steer that doesn't want cooperating. Something crossed his face. Not quite the almost smile. Something with more weight behind it. Ray was a fool, he said. Quiet, like the words had gotten loose before he'd fully decided to let them. I know. Don't think you do. Not yet. He turned back toward the house, favoring the bad leg more openly, now that the crisis had passed and there was nobody left to perform steadiness for. Man had a woman standing right in front of him who could have hauled his whole outfit through a hard winter without breaking a sweat over it. And all he saw was something to be embarrassed by in front of a crowd. Addie didn't answer that. Didn't trust her voice to hold steady if she tried. But she carried the words with her back to the kitchen, and they sat warm in her chest the rest of that morning. Warmer even than the stove she'd left burning low, while she'd run to fetch a rope for a man she'd known, at that point, for exactly 2 days. By the third day, her hands had blistered twice over and healed into something tougher. By the fourth, she'd learned the names of both milk cows, learned which hinge on the pantry door stuck if you didn't lift it just so, learned that Ezra took his coffee black and his silence generally undisturbed until he'd finished the first cup of it. And by the fifth day, she'd learned something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with hinges or coffee at all. She'd been going through the pantry that morning, cataloging what remained against what winter would demand of it, when she found the ledger tucked behind a row of preserve jars, dusty, half-forgotten, the kind of book a man keeps because he's supposed to and stops looking at because the looking hurts more than the not knowing. She hadn't meant to open it, except her hands did it anyway, the way hands do sometimes when the rest of you hasn't quite caught up to the decision yet. Numbers, columns, feed costs, supply costs, the ordinary bones of a working ranch laid out in a careful hand that wasn't Ezra's own too careful. Even the penmanship of a man who'd learned to write ledgers for other men's approval. Crane's hand, she recognized it from a note he'd left tacked to the barn door 2 days before, and the numbers didn't add up. Not by a little. Not the kind of small honest error any bookkeeper makes at the end of a long season. By a lot. Feed purchases logged twice over in the same month. A supply run to town that showed on the ledger, but that Ezra himself had mentioned, offhand, over supper mentioned he'd made himself, alone, because Crane had been off elsewhere that week entirely. Addie sat very still on the pantry floor, the ledger open across her knees, because either Ezra Calloway had a memory worse than any man she'd ever met, or somebody had been writing figures into this book that didn't match a single thing that had actually happened on this ranch. He closed the ledger. Slow. Careful. Put it back exactly where she'd found it, behind the preserve jars, dust disturbed no more than it had to be. She didn't say anything to Ezra that night. Not yet. Not until she understood the shape of what she'd found, and not until she trusted her own eyes over a man's careful handwriting she'd only met once, tacked to a barn door. But she thought about it. All through supper. All through the washing up after. Thought about Crane's not quite right smile out by the barn that first afternoon. Thought about the way Ezra's jaw had tightened twice now at the mention of his own leg. Something was wrong at Stone Creek. Something that had nothing at all to do with whether a woman built like Addie Winslow could keep a house fed through the winter. She went into town on the 6th day for salt and thread, riding the wagon alone this time. Ezra kept back by a fence line that needed mending before the weather turned for good. Briar Hollow hadn't warmed to her. She felt it the moment she stepped down outside the dry goods store, the same sideways glances. The same conversations that dropped a beat too late and started up again a beat too loud, except now they carried a new flavor mixed in with the old. Not just the biggest bride anybody ever saw off a train. Now also the woman living out at Calloway's place, unmarried still, under a roof that wasn't rightfully hers to be under. Miss Winslow. The shopkeeper's wife said it like a verdict rather than a greeting. Didn't expect to see you back in town so soon. Needed salt, I'm sure you did. The insinuation sat there in the space between them, plain as anything, and Addie found she no longer had the energy to pretend she hadn't heard it. Mr. Calloway's fence needed mending, she said. Level. I came for salt and thread. That's the whole of my business here today. Of course. The woman's smile didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. None of my concern how a household runs itself out past town limits. Addie paid for her salt. Left before the woman could find a way to make it her concern after all. Outside, the boy who swept the barbershop boardwalk had abandoned his broom entirely, watching her cross the street with open curiosity instead of the sideways glances she'd grown used to. He couldn't have been more than 10, freckled, missing a front tooth he clearly hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious about. "You're the giant lady," he said, not unkind, simply factual the way children were sometimes, before the town had finished teaching them which facts were meant to be said politely and which weren't meant to be said at all. "I'm Miss Winslow," Addie said. "But yes, I suppose I am rather tall. My pa says you could probably beat Big Tom Halloran at arm wrestling. He's the strongest man in the county." "Everybody says so, does he now?" "I bet you could beat him." The boy looked her over with the frank assessment only a child could manage without any cruelty attached to it at all. "You got arms like a blacksmith." Addie found herself laughing before she'd quite decided to. Real laughter, the first of the whole difficult week, startled out of her by a freckled boy who'd meant the observation as nothing but plain admiration. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the boy could have understood. "That might be the finest compliment anybody's paid me since I got off that train." He grinned his gap-toothed grin and went back to his broom, already losing interest, already moving on to whatever else a boy his age found worth noticing on an ordinary Briar Hollow morning. Addie carried the moment with her the rest of the walk, small and warm against the cold of everything else the town kept handing her. Because it turned out she was learning that not every set of eyes in this valley saw her the same way the crowd at the train platform had. Some of them, unburdened yet by grown notions of what a woman was supposed to look like, simply saw a person built strong enough to be useful and admired her plainly for it. Outside, she nearly walked straight into Agatha Mercer, coming the other direction with a basket over one arm. "Miss Winslow." Agatha's voice carried none of the shopkeeper's wife's careful poison, just plain assessment, the way she'd looked at Addie from her own porch that first morning on the road out to Stone Creek. "You look tired." "I look like a woman who's been up since 4 every morning for the better part of a week." "Suits you better than the alternative did." Agatha fell into step beside her, unbothered by whatever stares the two of them drew together. One woman well past 60 and one built like she could carry a barn door under one arm if the need arose. "How's the ranch treating you?" "Well enough." "The house, anyway." Something in the way Addie said it made Agatha slow her step. "And the rest of it?" Addie hesitated, because she barely knew this woman. One wagon ride's worth of a wave, one porch full of drying laundry, and yet something about Agatha Mercer's steady, unhurried attention made a person want to tell her things. "Ezra's leg," Addie said finally, quiet, careful. "He says it was a wagon wheel." "Bad ground." Agatha's face changed, just slightly. "The way weather changes before you can properly name what's coming. Is that what he told you? Is it not what happened?" Agatha was quiet a long moment, basket shifting on her arm, eyes gone somewhere distant back. Addie suspected, to whatever afternoon 2 years ago had actually put that limp into Ezra Calloway's stride. "I've lived next to that valley the better part of 20 years, Agatha said at last, choosing her words the way a woman chooses stones across a creek running higher than usual. "Seen a great many accidents happen out that way. Some of them were accidents." A pause, heavier than the words around it. "Some of them I've had my doubts about since the day they happened. I'll say no more than that. Standing here on a public street with half this town's ears turned our direction whether they'll admit it or not." "Mrs. Mercer, come by my place sometime," Agatha said, already turning to go, basket settling back against her hip. "When you've a free hour and nobody's ears to worry over but mine. I've a long memory, Miss Winslow, and a longer patience for watching a good man get worn down by things he won't say out loud. Might be time somebody finally said them for him." She was gone before Addie could ask another question, disappearing into the dry goods store with the same unhurried pace she'd arrived with, leaving Addie standing alone on the boardwalk with a bag of salt, a spool of thread, and a whole new weight settled into her chest that had nothing to do with either one. She didn't say anything to Ezra that evening either, because what would she even say? "Your leg. Your manager. So often's wrong here, and I can't yet prove any of it, only feel it. The way you feel a storm coming before the sky's given you a single honest reason to believe one. A woman with 5 days' worth of standing in this house didn't get to walk in and start accusing the man who ran it or the man he trusted to help him run it of something she couldn't yet put a proper name to. So she cooked instead, said nothing, watched Ezra across the supper table the way she'd started watching him most evenings now. Not for what he said, which was rarely much, but for the spaces between what he said the pauses that told her more than his words ever seemed to manage on their own. "You're quiet again," he said, mid-meal, echoing almost exactly what he'd said to her on the wagon ride days before. "So are you. I'm always quiet. Not like this," he set his fork down. Looked at her, properly, the way he'd looked at her, that first evening in the kitchen, weather reading, trying to work out what front was moving in. Something happened in town? Addie considered lying. Considered it seriously for the length of one full breath because she'd only known this man 6 days, and didn't yet have the right to go stirring up whatever quiet arrangement he'd made with his own past. Except she found when it came down to it that she didn't much want to lie to him. "I ran into Mrs. Mercer," she said instead. Careful. Choosing her own stepping stones the same way Agatha had chosen hers. "She mentioned your leg." Something shuddered behind Ezra's eyes. Quick. There and gone. Same as always. But she was learning to catch it now. The way you learn to catch a held breath in a room gone suddenly too still. Agatha talks a great deal for a woman who claims to mind her own business. She didn't say much, only that she had doubts.
"About what? You tell me, Mr. Calloway."
The kitchen went silent. Outside, wind picked up against the window, the first real bite of the season working its way down off the mountains, same as it had the night she'd arrived. "It was a wagon wheel," Ezra said finally. "Too flat, too rehearsed. The way a man recites something he's told himself so many times the true edges have worn smooth. Bad ground, nothing more complicated than that. That's what you told me the first day too, because it's true." "Is it?" He didn't answer. And in the not answering, Addie found the truest answer of all that. Whatever had happened to Ezra Calloway's leg 2 years back, he either didn't fully believe his own explanation of it, or he believed it and was afraid, for reasons she hadn't yet earned the right to understand, of what believing something different might cost him. She let it go, for tonight. But she filed it away, same as always, in the growing pile of things this ranch was keeping just barely out of her reach. They sat by the fire a while after, the way they'd started doing most nights that week. No particular reason for it, except that neither one seemed quite ready yet to climb the stairs to separate rooms. "You never asked me about Chicago," Addie said, watching the flames instead of him, which made the words easier somehow. "Why I really left. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Or you wouldn't. Neither one seemed like my business to go digging into. I was head chef there. 2 years. Best kitchen in the city, or near enough to it." She kept her eyes on the fire. "The owner cornered me one night after closing. I said no. Clear as anything." He didn't much care for the word. Ezra went very still beside her. I pushed past him. She went on. Quiet now, the words coming easier the further into them she got, like a door that only stuck on the first push. "Next morning I was let go. Conduct unbecoming, they called it. Nobody asked whose conduct they meant." The fire popped once, loud in the quiet room. "I never told Ray that," Addie said. "Never told my own family the whole of it either. Easier to let them believe I simply wasn't fit for fine company. Easier than watching their faces try to decide whether they believed me." Ezra's jaw had gone tight, the same tightness she'd learned to read as something close to anger, though never once in this week had she seen it turn toward her. "Man's name," he said. Low. "You don't have to say it if you don't want to. Wouldn't do either of us any good, saying it out here in Montana." She managed something close to a smile, though it cost her. "He's 3 states back. Can't touch me from there. Can't touch anybody. So long as I don't hand him the room in my head to keep living in." "I believe you," Ezra said. Simple. No hesitation in it at all. For what that's worth. It was worth, Addie found, a great deal more than he probably understood. Sisankins, saying it. Because she'd carried that story alone for the better part of 2 years, certain that saying it out loud would only earn her the same doubtful, careful looks her own family had given her when she'd offered them half of it. And here was a man she'd known 8 days, believing the whole of it without so much as a pause. Like belief cost him nothing at all where she was concerned. "Thank you," she said. "Wasn't a kindness. Was only the truth far as I can see it." He looked at her then, properly, firelight catching the weathered lines of his face. "You're not the only one this house has been keeping quiet things for. Might be time I started matching you, story for story, instead of just collecting yours." He didn't say more than that. Not that night. But it was, Addie thought, watching him climb the stairs a while later, the closest thing to a promise he'd made her all week, that whatever Stone Creek was still holding back from her, The holding wasn't going to last forever. The seventh morning arrived gray and still, the kind of stillness that comes right before Montana decides to remind everyone exactly who's in charge of the weather out here. Ezra found her in the kitchen before dawn, same as every morning that week, except this time he didn't head straight for the coffee. He stood in the doorway a moment, watching her work, and there was something different in his face this morning. Something he'd clearly been turning over most of the night, judging by the shadows under his eyes. "Week's up today," he said. Addie's hand stilled over the dough. "I know. You don't have to answer me now. Wagon's ready whenever you want it, whichever direction you're wanting to go." She turned to face him. Flour on her hands again, same as that first evening, like the two of them kept finding their way back to this exact configuration, her at the stove, him in the doorway, a question hanging in the air between them heavier than either one wanted to say out loud. "Ask me properly," she said. "Ask you what?" "You know what." Something shifted in his face. Understanding, maybe. Or maybe just the particular relief of a man who'd been bracing all week for a conversation he didn't know how to start on his own. He crossed the kitchen, stopped close enough that she had to tip her chin up slightly to hold his eyes, which almost nobody in her whole life had ever made her do before, and something about that alone nearly undid her, more than anything he was about to say. "Can you cook?" he asked. Quiet this time. Not a stranger's question anymore, the way it had been that first evening, something closer to a vow already forming underneath it. "You know the answer to that, Ezra Calloway. Ask me to ask it anyway. Second time's got to count for something. Then ask it like you mean to keep the answer." Addie Winslow. His voice had gone rough, quieter than she'd heard it all week. "Will you stay? Marry me proper. Church and papers. Same as I said that first night. Not because the week's run out and you've nowhere else standing ready for you. Because I've watched you all week and I think..." He started again, the way he seemed to do whenever he was reaching for something more honest than his usual plain talk allowed for. "I think this house forgot how to be a home before you walked into it, and I'd like to find out what it remembers. With you standing in this kitchen a while longer." The kitchen went very quiet, because it wasn't romance exactly. Not the kind her mother used to describe back before the pen went too shaky to write about anything at all. But it was something. Something built out of 6 days' worth of proof instead of 3 months' worth of careful letters, and Addie was starting to understand that the second kind might hold up a great deal better than the first ever had. "Yes," she said. Simple. The way he said most things. "Yes. You heard me the first time, Mr. Calloway." And there it was again, that almost smile living mostly in his eyes, refusing all week to fully commit itself to his mouth. Except this time it got a little further than almost. This time it very nearly arrived. "Church is in 3 days' time," he said. "Preacher only comes through once a month, this far out. We'll want to tell Agatha. She'll want to stand up for you, I expect, same as she stood up for Eliza." The name landed soft in the kitchen. Addie noticed it the way he said it without flinching this time, the way the word came easier than it had that first night, like something in him had shifted too over the course of this same quiet week. "I'd like that," Addie said. "You'll have more than one," Ezra said. "This house included, I'd wager, if a house could stand up for anybody at all." He found the letter again that night. Third time since she'd arrived. Ezra stood in the small room off the kitchen, with Eliza's handwriting soft under his thumb, the way he'd stood there that very first evening, except something had shifted enough in the intervening week that he no longer felt like a man caught out by his own grief. He read it properly this time, all the way through. She'd written it plain, the way Eliza wrote most things. No flowery language dressing up what she meant. A woman who can stand her own ground and still bend enough to hold a house together. Hands that don't flinch from hard work, and a spine that doesn't bow to a room full of people telling her what she is. "That's who I hope finds you, Ezra, when I'm not here to anymore. Don't you dare let pride keep you from her, whoever she turns out to be." He'd read those words once, the week after the funeral, and felt only the raw, useless anger of grief too fresh to hold anything but itself. Tonight he felt something else standing over them. Because there wasn't a single line in that letter that didn't describe, plain as morning, the woman currently asleep 2 floors above him with flour, probably still worked into the creases of her palms. He didn't know what to make of that. Didn't know whether to call it coincidence, or grace, or simply the particular way grief sometimes clears a path for a person, if you let it run its full course instead of standing in front of it, arms crossed, refusing the whole business on principle. He folded the letter. Didn't put it away this time. Carried it instead to the small writing desk by the window, set it down open, where morning light would find it first thing, and stood a long while, looking at Eliza's handwriting like a man finally ready to stop treating a blessing as though it were a betrayal. "I hope you're right about her," he said quietly, to the empty room, to whatever part of Eliza might still be listening from wherever she'd gone. "I hope to God you're right." The house held its silence around him, same as it always did. But it was, he thought, a different kind of silence than the one he'd been living inside for 2 long years. This one felt less like absence, more like room being made. They told Crane that evening, over the ordinary business of the day, Ezra mentioning it the same plain way he mentioned. Everything matter of fact, no ceremony to it. Crane's face did something complicated for just a moment. Gone before Addie could fully read it. Same as always, but she caught the shape of it anyway. Not surprise exact calculation. Well, now, he tipped his hat, the same not quite right smile, settling back into place from that first afternoon in the barn. "Congratulations to the both of you. Ranch could use a woman's steady hand in the house, I'd say. Long past due, if you don't mind my saying so." "I don't mind," Ezra said. "Preacher's Sunday, you said?" "Sunday. I'll see the place looking its best by then." Crane touched his hat again, turning to go, and something in his voice as he walked away sat wrong in Addie's chest, the way a held note sits wrong when it doesn't quite resolve where you expect it to. Wouldn't want anything spoiling such a fine occasion. Addie watched him disappear toward the barn, lantern already lit against the coming dusk. "He doesn't like this," she said quietly, once he was well out of earshot. "Crane doesn't like much of anything, far as I've ever noticed." Ezra said it easy enough, but Addie caught the way his own eyes tracked the lantern light, a moment longer than the comment suggested he should. "Man's kept this place running while I couldn't hardly walk myself. I owe him more patience than most." "That's not an answer to what I said." Ezra didn't reply to that either. And Addie, standing in the yard, with the cold coming down hard off the mountains, found herself thinking again of ledgers gone wrong behind preserved jars, and a wagon wheel that might or might not have been the whole truth, and a woman named Agatha Mercer who'd offered, on a public street, to say out loud the things a good man wouldn't say for himself. She decided right there in the yard that she'd take Agatha up on that offer. Soon, before Sunday if she could manage it. Because whatever was wrong at Stone Creek Ranch, she was about to marry her way straight into the middle of it. And a woman walking into a storm, she'd learned the hard way this past week, did a great deal better going in with her eyes open than she ever did going in blind. She rode out to Agatha's the very next afternoon, telling Ezra only that she wanted to properly thank the neighbor who'd offered to stand up for her at the wedding, which was true, just not the whole of it. Agatha met her on the porch like she'd been expecting the visit all along. "Took you a day longer than I figured," Agatha said, settling into a porch chair and nodding Addie toward the other. "Sit. This isn't a short conversation, and my knees don't do well standing through long ones anymore." Addie sat. "Ask me your question, Miss Winslow. The real one. Not the thank you told your husband-to-be you were riding out here for." "How did you?" "Because I've lived next to that man's grief for 2 years running, and I recognize the shape of somebody circling the edges of it, trying to work out how deep it goes before they step in themselves." Addie took a breath, let it out slow. "The wagon wheel," she said. "Was it really an accident?" Agatha was quiet a long moment, looking out over her own fields gone gold and stiff with frost, the same view Addie had passed on the wagon that first day. "Ezra was thrown from a hay wagon 2 winters back," Agatha said finally. "Broke the leg bad enough it never set proper. That much is true, near as anybody knows it. But that hay wagon had a wheel that Crane himself greased, and checked not 2 days before. Man's meticulous about his equipment. Always has been. Doesn't strike me as the sort to miss a crack in an axle he'd handled with his own hands not 48 hours prior." Agatha's eyes came back to Addie's, steady, unhurried, the same weight behind them. Addie had first noticed on the road to Stone Creek. "I've never said that to Ezra. Never had proof enough to say it to anybody. Just an old woman's doubts, same as I told you on the street. But you asked me plain, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't lie to a woman who asked me plain." The porch went quiet, wind moving through the grass beyond it, cold and steady, and entirely indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. "Why would Crane want to hurt him?" Addie asked, though some part of her had already begun to guess. "Same reason most men in this territory want anything." Agatha's mouth went tight. "Land's worth more than it used to be. Now the railroad's pushing this way. A man managing somebody else's ranch makes a manager's wage. A man who owns it outright makes considerably more than that. Ezra's held on through 2 hard winters, mostly out of stubbornness. Might be somebody's grown tired of waiting for the stubbornness to run out on its own. Addie sat with that. Let it settle into the same place where the ledger's wrong numbers had already been sitting for 2 days now, waiting for company. I found discrepancies, she said slowly, in the accounts. Numbers that don't match what actually happened. Agatha's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. The first real surprise Addie had seen cross the woman's face since arriving. Did you now? I haven't told Ezra yet. Good. Agatha said it quick, firm, more urgency in the single word than in everything she'd said before it. Don't. Not yet. Not till you've got more than a woman's doubts and a few crooked numbers to bring him. Man like Ezra Calloway won't move against somebody he trusts on a hunch alone, even his new wife's hunch. You'll need proof solid enough that he can't talk himself back out of believing it. And if I find that proof, Agatha's face went hard, weathered, the face of a woman who'd buried more than one thing in her time and had learned exactly how much a person could survive losing before it broke them for good. Then you bring it to him, she said. All of it. And you pray, Miss Winslow, that whatever Crane's been building toward hasn't already gotten too far along to stop by the time you do. Addie sat quiet a moment, watching the frost-stiff grass bend under a wind picking up steady out of the north. Can I ask you something, she said, Sumas. About Eliza. Agatha's face softened, just slightly, the hard edges of the last few minutes giving way to something gentler. You can ask. Might be I won't answer all of it. Some things belong to the dead, not to the living asking after them. What was she like? Agatha almost smiled at that, the memory clearly a fond one, despite whatever grief still lived underneath it. Stubborn as any woman I ever met, and I've met a great many stubborn women in my time, myself included. Small thing, though. Delicate built. The kind of woman this whole territory seems built to break in half within a decade if the work doesn't kill her outright. Her eyes came back to Addie, steady. She loved that man fierce. Loved this valley fierce too, for all it never once went easy on her. And when the fever took her, it took something out of Ezra Calloway that I've watched 2 long years trying to find its way back. Do you think Addie stopped? Started again, choosing the words with care. Do you think he can love again? Truly. Not just the arrangement of it. Agatha studied her a long moment, the same unhurried assessment she'd offered on the road that first day. I think, she said slowly, that a man doesn't offer a stranger his dead wife's kitchen unless some part of him already believes the answer's yes. Whether he's admitted it to himself yet is an entirely different question. Might take him a while longer to catch up to what the rest of him already seems to know. She reached over, patted Addie's hand once, brisk and unsentimental. Give him time, Miss Winslow, and give yourself some too. Grief and hope aren't natural enemies, whatever folks like to say. Sometimes they grow best in the very same soil. Addie rode back toward Stone Creek as the light went long and gold across the valley, the same light that had greeted her that very first day, the same wide grass rolling toward mountains that still, after a full week, hadn't come any closer than they'd first appeared. She thought about the ledger, about a wagon wheel greased 2 days before it failed, about a wedding now 2 days off, and a man who deserved to walk into it with his eyes open, same as she'd promised herself she would. She thought, too, about her mother's handwriting you were built for keeping, and wondered whether her mother had meant more by that than simply flour and fire and a family kept fed through winter. Whether keeping sometimes meant standing guard over a thing as much as it meant nourishing it. The wind picked up as Stone Creek came into view below her, smoke rising steady from the chimney, lamplight already glowing warm in the kitchen window where Ezra would be waiting. Same as every evening this week, for a meal she'd cook with hands that had learned, in the space of 7 short days, to belong somewhere at last. She meant to keep that house standing, whatever it cost her to do it. She couldn't sleep that night. Too much sitting unfinished in her chest, the wedding, 2 days off. Agatha's warning still ringing plain in her ears, the ledger waiting behind its preserved jars for whatever proof it would eventually take to make Ezra believe what she already halfway believed herself. So when she heard the barn door somewhere past midnight, she was awake to hear it. She went to the window, cold glass under her palm, breath fogging faint against it. A lantern moved across the yard below, low and careful, the particular unhurried care of a man who didn't want his movement noticed. Crane. He wasn't heading toward the stock. Wasn't checking fences or feed, not at this hour, not with that kind of deliberate quiet to his step. He crossed instead toward the far side of the barn, the side that faced away from the house, away from any window that might catch him at whatever he was about. Addie pulled a shawl over her nightclothes. Didn't stop to think whether that was wise. Went down the stairs quiet as she could manage, out the kitchen door into air cold enough to burn. By the time she reached the yard, the lantern light had already gone still on the far side of the barn. Voices, low. Two of them, though she couldn't make out words at this distance, couldn't be certain, even, that the second voice belonged to anyone she'd recognize if she got close enough to hear it clearly. She took 3 more steps, careful, silent as she knew how to be. A dog barked somewhere near the house, not hers. Not Ezra's either. Some stray drawn by the cold or the smell of the barn, and the lantern light on the far side went out at once. Sudden, deliberate, silence rushed back in to fill the space where the voices had been. Addie stood frozen in the yard, a long moment, heart going hard against her ribs, waiting to see if anyone would come around the corner of that barn to find her standing there in her nightclothes, with nothing but a shawl and a lot of unanswered questions. Nobody came. She made her way back inside, slow, careful not to let the door catch the wind, and climbed the stairs to lie awake the rest of the night, turning it over. A meeting, in the dark, 2 days before a wedding that Elias Crane had made abundantly, uneasily clear he had no real wish to see happen. She didn't know who the second voice belonged to, but she intended to find out, and soon, because whatever quiet arrangement Crane was keeping in the shadows of that barn, it was moving now on a clock she no longer controlled. 2 days. 2 days until she stood before a preacher and became, in the eyes of the law and the whole of Briar Hollow, Ezra Calloway's wife. In truth, in 2 days, she suspected, watching that dark barn from her cold window until sleep finally, reluctantly took her, until whatever Elias Crane had been building toward for 2 long years finally came due. Somewhere out past the barn, where a lantern had burned later most nights than any honest ranch hand's work required, Elias Crane moved through the dark with the particular quiet of a man who believed, still, that nobody in this valley had yet begun to notice him at all. He was wrong about that. He simply didn't know it yet. Stone Creek Ranch, the night before the wedding. Addie couldn't sleep. Not with the wedding 2 mornings gone down to 1. Not with Agatha's warning still sitting heavy in her chest, and a ledger behind the preserved jars that she still hadn't found the courage to bring in front of Ezra. She'd waited on Agatha's advice all week, gather more than doubts, before speaking a word of it aloud. But waiting, with the wedding now this close, had started to feel less like patience, and more like a woman leaving herself unarmed on purpose. So she did the only thing that ever settled her hands when the rest of her wouldn't settle. She went down to the kitchen, lit a single lamp, and on the blank pages at the very back of her mother's recipe book, pages she'd always meant to fill with recipes of her own someday, once she'd earned the right to add anything to that sacred, careful record, she copied out every wrong number she could remember from Crane's ledger. Because a book like that, she reasoned, sitting alone at the kitchen table, with the house gone quiet around her, wasn't the kind of thing anybody would think to search. Not a recipe book. Not a dead woman's careful handwriting with a daughter's plain hand added on at the very back of it. It felt, in a strange way, like her mother was helping her hide it. She worked until well past midnight, transcribing dates and figures from memory as best she could, cross-checking them twice against what she recalled from that first quiet afternoon on the pantry floor. It wasn't perfect. Wouldn't hold up, probably, in front of a judge in some proper courtroom back east. But it was something. A record that existed outside that one dusty ledger, in a place Crane would never think to look. She closed the book, held it a moment against her chest, same as always, and went up to bed with no way of knowing that the precaution she'd just taken, on a whim, past midnight, was about to be the only thing standing between Stone Creek Ranch and total ruin by morning. The smell of smoke woke her first, before the shouting even started. Addie was down the stairs and out the kitchen door before her mind had fully caught up to her body, and the sight that met her in the yard stopped her flat. The barn. Flames already climbing the far wall, orange against the black sky, smoke rolling thick and low across the yard. The whole night suddenly loud, with the sound she'd never forget, wood cracking, animals screaming. Somewhere underneath it all, the frantic rush of boots against frozen ground. Because fire didn't wait. Didn't care whose wedding was 2 mornings off. whose ledger sat hidden inside a recipe book upstairs. It only spread, hungry, indifferent, the way disaster always seemed to arrive, precisely when a person could least afford it. Ezra was already there, dragging the milk cows clear, his bad leg buckling once beneath him before he forced himself upright and kept moving. Crane stood nearer the house, shouting something Addie couldn't make out over the roar of the fire. She ran, because there wasn't time to think, only time to move, to grab the nearest bucket, to fall into the same rope-throwing rhythm she'd found with Ezra that first week, two bodies working, without needing to trade a single wasted word between them. The heat hit her first, a wall of it, thick enough to steal the breath clean out of her lungs, then the smoke stinging her eyes until the whole yard blurred to shapes and firelight. She didn't stop, couldn't. Bucket after bucket, hands blistering raw all over again, until her arms burned worse than the barn itself. Until somewhere past the worst of it, past the moment she genuinely wasn't certain, the whole structure wouldn't come down around them. The flames finally began to lose their fight against the line of exhausted, soot-black bodies working to smother them. They saved the horses, saved most of the tack, lost the hay store entirely, and half the far wall besides, and by the time the flames had finally been beaten back into smoking ruin, dawn was already bleeding gray along the eastern hills. Addie stood in the wreckage of the yard, soot-streaked, hands blistered raw all over again, breathing hard. That was when Crane found his voice. "Lamp," he said it loud. Loud enough to carry to the two ranch hands who'd come running from the bunkhouse. Loud enough, Addie understood with a sick drop in her stomach, to be overheard exactly the way he intended it to be. "She's the only one been in and out of that barn at odd hours all week. Saw her myself before last sneaking round after midnight." "That's a lie," Addie said, flat. Steady, though her heart was going hard enough to shake her voice if she let it. "Is it?" Crane turned to Ezra, face arranged into something almost convincingly like regret. "I don't like saying it. God knows I don't. But a man's got to speak plain when his own barn's just burned to the ground." Ezra's eyes went from Crane to Addie and back again. For one long, terrible second, Addie thought she saw doubt cross his face. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. "Addie doesn't lie," Ezra said. Simple, final. The way he said most things that mattered. Whatever burned that barn, it wasn't her hand that struck the match. "With respect, Ezra, I said what I said." His voice hadn't risen. Didn't need to. There was something underneath it now that silenced even Crane's protest halfway out of his mouth. "You'll want to be careful, accusing my wife of something you can't prove, especially the morning before she becomes my wife in the eyes of the law too." Crane's jaw tightened. Something flickered behind his eyes, not guilt exactly. Calculation, same as always, the gears of the man visibly turning to find some new angle. "Course," he said finally, backing down just enough to seem reasonable. "Didn't mean to speak out of turn. Man's shaken is all. Losing a barn'll do that." He walked off toward the ruined structure, already barking orders at the ranch hands about salvaging what timber could still be used. Addie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You believed me," she said quietly, once Crane was well out of earshot. Just like that. Wasn't hard. Ezra looked at her, soot on his own face, exhaustion plain in the lines around his eyes. "I've known you 2 weeks, Addie Winslow, long enough to know the shape of your honesty by now. Didn't need proof to trust it." It was, Addie thought, standing in the wreckage of a barn, with dawn coming up cold and gray around them, the single kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. "There's something you should see," she said inside. "Before the whole house wakes and Crane finds some reason to be standing over my shoulder while I show it to you." She laid the recipe book open on the kitchen table between them, the transcribed figures plain in her own careful hand at the very back of it. "I found the ledger 5 days ago," she said, "behind the preserve jars. Numbers don't match what actually happened on this ranch feed bought twice over. Supply runs logged that never happened. I copied what I could remember last night before I even knew there'd be a fire to worry about." Ezra studied the page a long moment. Silent. "You think Crane's been stealing from me? I think somebody has. And I think whoever it is didn't much care for the idea of a wedding, bringing a second set of eyes into this house permanent." His jaw worked once, tight, the same tightness she'd learned to recognize over 2 weeks of careful watching Agatha, he said slowly. "This is what you two talked about, out on her porch. She had her own doubts. About your leg." Addie watched his face carefully as she said it. about whether that wagon wheel was really an accident at all. The kitchen went very quiet. I've wondered, Ezra admitted finally, low, like the words had been sitting locked away a long while, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Middle of the night, mostly. Never let myself think it through to the end, because the end of that thought meant a man I'd trusted 2 years running had tried to see me crippled, or worse, for the sake of this land. I think the fire tonight was meant to burn that ledger before anybody official came looking at it, Addie said. Bank inspection, maybe. Something with a deadline attached to it. Bank man's coming Thursday, Ezra said, voice gone rough. Routine visit was going to be anyway. The two of them sat with that a moment, the ruined barn just visible through the window, smoke still rising thin off the last of the embers. We can't move on him yet, Addie said. Not without more than a handful of copied numbers and an old woman's doubts. Agatha said the same. We need proof solid enough he can't talk his way clear of it. We've got 2 days, Ezra said. Bank man Thursday. Wedding tomorrow. Then we'd best not waste either one of them. Crane found her alone, in the kitchen, that afternoon, Ezra out assessing what could be salvaged from the barn. The ranch hands scattered across the property, hauling charred timber. He didn't bother with pretense this time. You've been in that ledger, he said. No greeting first. Just the accusation, laid down flat between them like a hand of cards finally shown. Addie kept kneading the bread in front of her, hands steady though her pulse had picked up hard and fast. Have I? Don't play games with me, Miss Winslow. I've watched you close enough these 2 weeks to know when a woman's found something she shouldn't have. He crossed the kitchen, voice dropping low, almost gentle, the tone of a man trying a different kind of persuasion now that intimidation hadn't worked. I'll make this simple. There's money in it for you. Enough to see you set up comfortable somewhere, far from here, Denver maybe, someplace with a proper kitchen worthy of your talents. All you'd need do is climb back on that wagon tomorrow morning and keep riding straight past the church. You want me to abandon my own wedding. I want you to think about what's actually good for you. His voice had gone almost kind now, almost convincing, the same practiced warmth she imagined he'd used on this whole valley for 2 long years, while quietly bleeding it dry. Ezra Calloway's ranch is going under, one way or another. Man's too stubborn to see it, but the debts are coming due whether he admits it or not. Better you're comfortable and far away when that happens than standing in the wreckage of it same as him. Addie set down the dough, wiped her hands slow, deliberate, buying herself a moment to make sure her voice would come out steady. How much? She said. Something like triumph flickered across Crane's face. $200. Cash tonight, and you're on that wagon by first light. That's a great deal of money for a man who claims to be worried about my comfort. Call it generous. I'd call it desperate. Addie looked at him steady, the same steady look she'd given Ray on that platform 2 weeks and a whole lifetime ago. You wouldn't be offering me money to disappear if you didn't already know exactly what I'd found in that ledger, Mr. Crane. And you wouldn't know that unless you were the one who wrote Vows into it yourself. His face went cold. I'd think carefully before you say anything more, Miss Winslow. I have thought carefully. Her voice didn't shake, not once. And my answer's no. I won't be bought. I won't be scared off either. Not after everything it's already cost me to stand in this kitchen at all. You'll want to think carefully yourself, Mr. Crane, about what happens Thursday when that bank man arrives and finds a wife in this house, instead of an empty ranch you were counting on being easy to pick apart. Crane's expression flickered frustration, quickly smoothed back over into something more careful. $250 then. My final offer, and considerably more generous than you'll find anywhere else in this territory. You keep raising the number like it's the amount that's wrong. It isn't the amount, Mr. Crane. It's the whole rotten shape of what you're asking. Then perhaps I'm not making myself clear. His voice dropped lower, harder now. All pretense of gentleness finally stripped away. You'll take the money. Or you'll find that a woman with your particular history, a dismissed cook from Chicago, no family willing to vouch for her, run off on a bride contract already once before, doesn't make a terribly credible witness against a man this county's trusted for 2 years running. Think on that before you go, repeating any of what you believe you've found to anyone who might listen. For a long moment, Crane said nothing else at all, letting the threat settle, clearly certain it had landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Then the kitchen door opened, and Agatha Mercer stepped through it. Unannounced, a basket over one arm, and an expression on her face that suggested she'd heard a great deal more of that conversation than either of them had realized. "Elias Crane," she said, voice like flint striking steel. "I do believe that's the first time in 20 years I've heard you offer a woman money instead of taking something from her outright. Might be an improvement in its own way." Crane's composure cracked, just slightly, at the sight of her. "Agatha, this doesn't concern you. Everything in this valley concerns me, same as it always has. You do well to remember that before you go offering any more bribes in a kitchen with the windows open and a porch not 30 feet off where an old woman happens to be walking by." Something shifted in Crane's face, the first real crack of fear Addie had seen in him since arriving at Stone Creek. He left without another word, boots hard against the porch steps, and Addie let out a breath that felt like the first full one she'd taken in several long minutes. "You heard all of that," she said. "Enough of it." Agatha set her basket down, businesslike, already moving toward the stove, like she meant to help with supper whether anyone had asked her to or not. "Enough to stand up in front of the whole county tomorrow and swear to what I heard, if it comes to that. Man's finally given us more than an old woman's doubts to work with. Tomorrow's my wedding." "Then it seems," Agatha said, the faintest hint of a smile finally breaking through, "that you're about to have yourself a wedding day nobody in Briar Hollow will ever forget." The church was small, white painted, plain, the kind of building that had clearly been built by hands more concerned with usefulness than beauty. It was full anyway, fuller, Addie suspected, than most Sunday services ever managed, because half the county had turned out less for the ceremony itself than for the spectacle of watching it happen. She stood at the back a moment before walking in, Agatha beside her, smoothing a borrowed dress that fit considerably better than the one she'd worn off that train 2 weeks before. "Ready?" Agatha asked. "No," Addie admitted, "but I don't imagine ready's a feeling that's ever coming, so I'll walk in anyway." She did. The whispers started the moment she crossed the threshold. Same whispers as the platform, 2 weeks back, except this time, walking up an aisle toward a man who'd already told her, plain, that he believed her honesty without needing proof. The whispers landed differently, against, smaller, less able to reach the places inside her they used to reach so easily. Ezra stood waiting at the front, and something in his face when he saw her walk in, soot still faintly visible at his hairline from the fire he hadn't fully scrubbed away, coat pressed as best it could be on short notice, settled every last flutter of doubt still sitting in her chest. The preacher had barely finished the opening words when the church door opened again, hard, and Elias Crane strode in with the bank inspector at his side. 2 days early, both men's faces tight with purpose. "Apologies for the interruption," the bank man said, not sounding especially apologetic at all. "But Mr. Crane came to me this morning with some troubling information about the state of this ranch's finances. Felt it prudent to move up my visit. And Mr. Crane's report, I'll admit, reminded me of a letter that had already been sitting on my desk a month, or better, one I'd not thought much of until this morning, gave it a rather different light." A murmur ran through the packed church. Ezra's hand found Addie's, steady, and she understood, in that single touch, that whatever came next, they were meeting it together.
"This
troubling information," Ezra repeated, voice carrying easy across the quiet room. "That's an interesting choice of words, Elias, coming from the one man who's had sole charge of my books these 2 years running." "I only report what the numbers show," Crane said, though something in his voice had gone thin, less certain than it had been in that kitchen the day before. "Then let's have a look at what the numbers actually show," Addie said, stepping forward before she'd fully decided to, her mother's recipe book already in her hand, carried in from habit, from the same instinct that had kept it close, through 3 states and a wedding day besides. "Because I've a record of my own gathered from that very same ledger. That tells a rather different story than whatever Mr. Crane's been telling the bank this morning." The church went utterly silent. She opened the book to the back pages. "Read the figures out," plain, unhurried, the same steady voice she'd used in a kitchen 2 weeks before to answer a question that had mattered more than anyone watching that day had understood. "Feed purchases logged twice over. Supply runs that never happened. 2 years of careful, patient theft, dressed up in numbers too small individually to draw much notice, but large enough together to have quietly bled this ranch toward exactly the kind of ruin that would force a desperate sale. And there's more," Agatha said, rising from her pew, voice ringing clear through the church. I'll swear to it myself in front of God and this whole congregation. Yesterday afternoon, in that very kitchen, I heard Elias Crane offer this woman $200 to abandon her own wedding and disappear before the bank ever thought to look closer at his books. The murmur became something closer to an uproar. Crane's face had gone the color of old ash. This is preposterous. A woman scribbled notes against 2 years of careful record-keeping done in a hand that isn't mine, Ezra said, cutting him off. Voice hard now, hard in a way Addie hadn't yet heard from him. I know my own ledger's proper handwriting, Elias. Have for years. Never once questioned why yours differed so much from mine. Because I trusted you. That trust, I'm beginning to understand, was considerably more foolish than I ever let myself believe. There's one more matter, the bank inspector said slowly, reaching into his coat, pulling free a folded letter that made the color drain further still from Crane's face. Came across my desk last month. From a Mr. Edmund Ray, of Chicago, inquiring after the financial standing of Stone Creek Ranch and expressing considerable interest in acquiring the property, should it come available at, and I quote, a suitably reduced price. Addie's breath caught. Ray. The very name she'd promised herself. Weeks ago, she'd let work its way clean out of her mouth for good. You knew him, met, she said slowly, looking at Crane, understanding arriving all at once, cold and complete. You've been corresponding with Edmund Ray this whole while, waiting on this ranch to fail so you could sell it to him cheap and split whatever profit came of it between the two of you. Crane said nothing. Didn't need to. The truth of it was written plain enough across his face for the whole church to read without further translation required. I believe, the bank inspector said, folding the letter away again, that this matter warrants considerably more investigation than a wedding morning allows for. Mr. Crane, I'll need you to accompany me into town. 2 men near the back, deputies, Addie realized, that the inspector must have thought wise to bring along given the nature of his errand, moved forward to escort Crane from the church. At the door he turned back once, whatever composure he'd managed to keep, for 2 long years finally cracking apart entirely. You'd have lost this ranch anyway, he spat, the words aimed somewhere between Ezra and the whole silent congregation. Ray was only ever going to speed up what was already coming. Maybe, Ezra said. Unbothered, Addie's hand still steady in his own. But it'll be my ruin to walk into, if it comes to that, same as it'll be my triumph if it doesn't. Not yours to arrange behind my back for your own profit. The deputies led Crane out. For a moment after the door swung shut behind them, the church held itself in a silence so complete. Addie could hear her own heartbeat, still fast from the confrontation, still catching up to the fact that it was finally, truly over. Ezra turned to her, soot shadow still faint at his hairline, and for the first time since she'd walked in that morning, some of the tension eased out of his shoulders entirely. Some wedding, he said, low, just for her. I did warn you I might be trouble. You did. The corner of his mouth moved closer to a full smile than she'd seen from him yet, in 2 whole weeks of careful almost smiles. Turns out I liked the trouble considerably more than I expected to. Somewhere near the back, a familiar gap-toothed boy broke the wider silence, his voice carrying clear and unbothered through the hushed church. Told you she could beat Big Tom Halloran, he announced to nobody in particular, and this time, the laughter that rippled through the congregation came easy, grateful, the whole room exhaling together after the tension of the last several minutes. Even Mrs. Byram, seated stiff back near the front in her Sunday best, caught Addie's eye across the church and offered something that might, on a more generous day, have been mistaken for a genuine smile. Well, Agatha said, ever practical, ever unhurried, turning back toward the front of the church and addressing the preacher directly. I believe there was a wedding in progress. No sense letting a scoundrel's arrest delay it any further than it already has. The preacher, visibly relieved to have his ceremony back in hand, cleared his throat and continued. They said their vows plain, the way Ezra said everything. When it came time for him to speak his own words, unscripted, the way custom in this territory sometimes allowed a groom to add whatever he wished, he looked at Addie a long moment before he spoke at all. I told you once I didn't have another love match left in me, he said, voice carrying soft through the hushed church. Told myself the same thing for 2 years running, every night I sat alone in a house too quiet to properly live in. His hand tightened around hers. I was wrong. Wasn't out of love I didn't have left in me. It was only love I hadn't yet been given a fair enough reason to believe in again. Somewhere in the pews, Addie heard someone she never did learn who quietly began to cry. You gave me that reason, Ezra went on. One question in a cold kitchen answered, like you meant every single word of it. I've been trying to earn the right to ask you a different question ever since. He reached into his coat, drew out a folded letter, paper soft at its creases, and Addie understood, the moment she saw it, exactly what it was. A murmur of recognition moved through the pews closest to the front, a few of the older women who'd known Eliza well enough once to recognize the paper itself, the particular fold of it, before Ezra had said a single word about what it was. This was Eliza's, he said, voice rougher now than it had been a moment before, written the winter before she died. I've read it maybe 4 times since, and every single time it's described a woman I hadn't met yet, right down to the strength in her hands and the way she doesn't bow to a room full of people telling her what she is. His voice caught, just slightly, and he let it. I don't know how to explain that, except to say maybe some things get put into motion long before we're ready to understand them. I'd like you to have it. Not to fill some role Eliza left behind. Just because she asked me not to let pride keep me from you, whoever you turned out to be. Seems only right you should know that. Addie took the letter with hands that weren't entirely steady anymore. She didn't read it there in front of the whole congregation. Some things she understood without needing to be told belonged to a quieter moment than this one, but she held it against her chest the same way. She'd always held her mother's recipe book, and something in that gesture instinctive, unplanned told her, more clearly than any spoken vow could have, exactly how this letter was going to sit in her life from this day forward. Not a replacement. A blessing passed hand to hand across a grief that had finally, after 2 long years, found somewhere gentle to set itself down. That night, alone in the room that was now truly hers, theirs, while Ezra saw to the last of the evening chores despite the whole county having spent the day, insisting he take his wedding night off from ranch work entirely, Addie finally sat down and read the letter properly. Eliza's handwriting was neat, rounder than Addie's own, more careful. The hand of a woman who'd clearly been taught penmanship as a girl and never quite abandoned the lessons even in her final difficult winter. I don't know your name yet, the letter began, and I find I don't much need to. I only know Ezra, and I know this valley, and I know what both of them will require of whoever comes after me, if I'm honest enough with myself to admit somebody eventually will. Addie read slowly. Let each line settle before moving to the next. Don't let him talk you into thinking love only comes once. The letter went on. Nets of the handwriting, growing slightly less steady toward the middle, though the words themselves never wavered. He'll try. He's stubborn that way, same as he's stubborn about everything else worth loving in him. Don't let him win that particular argument. This valley's hard enough without 2 hearts refusing, out of some misplaced loyalty to grief, to let a good thing back in when it finally arrives. Near the very end, Eliza had written one final line, underlined twice, the ink pressed hard enough into the paper that Addie could still feel the shape of it beneath her fingertips years later. But whoever you are, thank you in advance for loving him well. Addie sat a long while with the letter open on her lap, tears she didn't bother wiping away tracking quiet down her face. Because it wasn't grief she felt reading it. Not exactly. It was something closer to being welcomed. She'd truly welcomed, by a woman she'd never meet, into a house and a life that had, until 2 short weeks ago, belonged entirely to somebody else. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the back pages of her mother's recipe book, right alongside the copied ledger figures that had helped save this very ranch, 2 very different kinds of inheritance now sharing the same worn, well-loved binding. When Ezra finally came up that night, he found her still awake, letter safely put away, waiting for him with a steadiness in her eyes that told him everything he needed to know without a single word passing between them. Winter came hard that year, same as Ezra had promised it would, but Stone Creek Ranch stood through it. Barn rebuilt by spring, funded in part by a settlement the bank eventually wrung out of Elias Crane's seized assets, in part by a county that had, somewhere between the fire and the wedding morning, quietly changed its mind about the woman it had once laughed off a train platform. The change came slow, the way most real changes do. A neighbor woman who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to trade recipes over the fence line. The shopkeeper's wife, of all people, started setting aside the good flour without being asked. The moment she saw the Calloway wagon coming up the road, and the gap-toothed boy from the boardwalk took to waving whenever Addie rode through town, proud as anything, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd known all along she was stronger than Big Tom Halloran. Mrs. Byram, for her part, never did apologize outright for the cold eggs and colder company of that first difficult morning. But she sent a wedding gift out to Stone Creek that spring, a set of good linens. Expensive, far beyond what courtesy required, with a note attached that read only, "Told you it wasn't an offer you'd get twice. Glad you had the sense to take it." Addie kept the note, tucked it, same as everything else worth keeping, into the back of her mother's recipe book, which had grown considerably fuller that year than she'd ever imagined it becoming when she'd first carried it, worn and precious, off a train 2 states in one whole lifetime ago. Addie never did learn much more about what became of Edmund Ray, beyond a brief mention in a Chicago newspaper. Agatha passed along one afternoon that spring his engagement to the banker's daughter had collapsed too. Apparently, once her family got wind of the land speculation scheme that had just cost him his standing with half of Chicago's investors. A different contract than the one he'd once broken with Addie. A different woman left holding the pieces of his ambition. Addie found she genuinely didn't care enough to read the article all the way through. She'd let his name work its way clean out of her mouth. It, same as Ezra had told her to, that very first wagon ride toward a ranch she hadn't yet learned to call home. It had taken practice. It had been worth doing anyway. One evening, deep into that first winter, with snow banked high against the windows and the whole valley gone quiet and white outside, Ezra found her in the kitchen the way he always seemed to, drawn there by whatever was simmering on the stove. He stood in the doorway, watched her a long moment, the same weather-reading patience he'd carried since the very first day. "Can you cook?" he asked. Addie turned, smiled, slow and easy, the particular smile of a woman who'd finally stopped bracing herself for the world's answer to that question and started simply living inside her own. "That's the 3rd time you've asked me that, Ezra Calloway. 3rd time's a habit, I suppose. Every time the answer's the same." She crossed the kitchen, rested her flour-dusted hand against his chest, steady, sure, exactly the way she'd learned, over one long and difficult winter, that she was allowed to be. "I can cook. I can keep this house standing through anything this valley throws at it, and I intend to go right on proving that, every single day, for as long as you'll have me." Ezra didn't answer with words this time. He simply pulled her close, snow falling soft and silent past the window behind them, and let the whole warm, well-fed kitchen speak for itself. Because some questions, once answered honestly enough, only ever needed asking to be finally, completely believed. Outside, the valley lay quiet under its deep snow of the season, Stone Creek running dark and unfrozen beneath the ice at its edges, patient the way this whole hard, beautiful country had taught Addie to be patient. Somewhere in the rebuilt barn, the horses shifted and settled for the night. Somewhere upstairs, a recipe book sat waiting on a shelf, fuller now than it had ever been her mother's careful hand, and Eliza's rounder one, and Addie's own steady script threading through the back pages where a ledger's stolen numbers had once needed hiding and now sat forgotten, replaced by recipes of her own at last. She understood, standing in that kitchen with Ezra's arms around her, and the whole cold Montana night pressing gentle against the windows. Exactly the woman her mother's handwriting had promised she'd become all those years ago, in a kitchen half a country away. Built for keeping and finally at long last kept. The end.